The Evolutionary Scientists, glimpses into the life and work of great thinkers in evolutionary biology. Edited by Pacey Minair. Narrated by Philip J. Mather. Introduction. The theory of evolution has a long history. However, it was not until Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace discovered that the wide variety of species we presently see were largely the result of natural selection did evolutionary studies have a solid scientific basis. In the past 160 years, a number of eminent biologists have contributed to our understanding of how complex life forms emerge from simpler, more rudimentary ones. This small book provides a glimpse into the life and work of 21 outstanding evolutionary thinkers, ranging, in alphabetical order, from Jerry Coyne to Edward O. Wilson. This is by no means an exhaustive list, since it is designed to show the wide diversity of scientists interested in evolutionary studies. Each entry, written by a different author, describes the life and work of the evolutionist and why he is significant and what contributions he has made to the field. Evolution in 4 minutes. Transcript from the film of the same name. Evolution isn't very difficult to understand, even though its implications are exceedingly important and complex. Each person is a unique pattern of information called a genome, or a living book. There are 46 chapters in our particular genome book, and roughly 25,000 pages that are called genes, with billions of lines of code. This code is written within molecules, or very small bits of material, called DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA is comprised of only 4 distinct nucleotides or letters, which can be remembered by the simple acronym CTAG, the C for cytosine, the T for thymine, the A for adenine, and the G for guanine. They get bound together in 2 long curved spaces known as a double helix. This is a model that was first discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick back in 1953, for which they won the Nobel Prize. How did I become me? In other words, why is my book of unique information written and shaped the way it is? Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace co-discovered natural selection in the mid-part of the 19th century. And it is the key mechanism behind how and why our unique genetic book is so configured. As Darwin explained in his groundbreaking study on the origin of species in 1859, if variation useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life. And from the strong principle of inheritance, they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized. This principle of preservation I have called, for the sake of brevity, natural selection. Perhaps the simplest way to understand this mechanism of evolution is by the acronym VISITED. V for variation, which can occur from sexual selection and genetic mutation, etc. I for inheritance. Just as clay tablets and scrolls and codices can preserve valuable data for future generations, so too can DNA retain important information for future offspring. S is for selection, which in this case means any sieving out process that arises in nature, ranging from competition within a species or from without, to overpopulation, to scarcity of resources, to natural disasters. The second I simply means including, indicating that the previous 3 factors must combine with T, which stands for time. Evolution needs a period of time in order to work, and we have this in abundance, given that our known universe is 13.8 billion years old, and our planet Earth is nearly 5 billion years old. The E represents equals, indicating that if you have enough variation and a way to record such changes, and there is a winnowing process which determines winning and losing combinations, and there is enough time to play out such permutations, it will inevitably lead to D, which stands for design. We are, in sum, the end result of a blind watchmaker. Darwin's and Wallace's great discovery was that rich complexity can arrive naturally without any intelligent guidance whatsoever. In other words, the incredible complexity we see around us and within us, from the shape of our eyes to the development of our neocortex, is the result of forces which are themselves sightless about what they will ultimately produce. This explains why our bodily mechanisms, though quite remarkable, are not perfect, but rather merely good enough to survive the universe's version of the Hunger Games, to pass on their genetic inheritance. In nature's vast publishing cosmos, we are books of information that have survived millions, if not billions of years of competition, where almost all tomes don't get the chance for reissues. We are successful new editions which have yet to go out of DNA print, and thus there is immense pressure on each one of us to make certain that we secure yet another publishing contract, so that our unique configuration of data doesn't get destroyed and forever lost. Perhaps it can be summarized this way: be mated or be dated. Jerry Coyne by Pacey Minnaert. Perhaps one of the most provocative contributors to evolutionary thought in recent times is Chicago-born biologist Jerry Coyne. Born on December 30th, 1949, Coyne is known primarily for his work on speciation and for his disapproval of those championing a synthesis between science and religion. Coyne graduated from the College of William and Mary in 1971 with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, and received a PhD in evolutionary biology from Harvard University in 1978. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Davis, and became an assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the years following that. In 1996, Coyne became a faculty member at the University of Chicago for the Department of Ecology and Evolution. He has been there ever since, and is currently a professor emeritus. In his book titled Why Evolution is True, Coyne reiterates the Darwinian theory of evolution and breaks this down into 6 distinct parts: evolution itself, gradualism, speciation, common ancestry, natural selection, and non-selective mechanisms of everyday change. Coyne explains that each aspect needs to be testable on their own, and provides ample evidence doing so. In short, he claims that the evidence for evolution stems from a plethora of resources, including the fossil record, vestigial organs, and developmental quirks, which he underscores to refute the creationist canard that all species are perfect by design. Though he is well versed in each aspect of this theory, as a geneticist, Coyne focuses primarily on speciation and appropriately illustrates the origin of species. As a fan of the Darwinian theory of evolution, Coyne's scientific work has been largely concerned with the genetics of species differences, and is aimed at understanding the evolutionary processes that produce new species. Coyne's work focuses on the origins of species and detecting these origins through the genetic patterns they produce, which, he argues, ultimately justifies the argument that evolution is indeed true. Speciation is the process in which new and distinct species are formed throughout evolution. When considering the current evolutions of species, it is necessary to consider the origins of such species to derive a more holistic picture of said organism's lineage, because doing so renders a more comprehensive, concrete narrative concerning the life of the past. He used Drosophila melanogaster, fruit fly, in order to figure out whether speciation involves a plethora or smattering of genes, which factors play a significant role in this process, and which factors cause gene sterility and inviability. According to Coyne's 1992 review article titled Genetics and Speciation, in which he reflects on his Drosophila conclusions and the new generalizations about speciation, there is a vast variation in the number of genes that influence, not cause, the development of different species. In his research, Coyne found that this number had to be at least 2, but could range anywhere from 2 to 900. Thus begging the notion that reproductive isolation is often polygenic. Polygenes occur when a gene's individual effect on a phenotype is too minute to be observed, but can make a noteworthy impression or change in one's genetics when combined with other genes. Coyne also notes that when an isolating factor is polygenic, direct genetic analysis is not powerful enough to distinguish between 9 and 900 genes, because of the limited number of genetic markers. From Genetics and Speciation 512. To counter this, Coyne proposes a more statistical approach, an interdisciplinary method of approaching speciation. He claims that while brute force genetics is effective, a statistical approach combining genetic and biogeographic information from hybrid zones can produce much larger estimates. From Genetics and Speciation 512. By employing a statistical approach, he believes that evolutionary patterns will become more apparent. He also implies that it is important to know how many loci there are and where these genes lie, and to specifically determine the quantity and location of speciation genes. In this regard, Coyne proposes the use of brute force genetics. Brute force genetics crosses closely similar pairs of species whose reproductive isolation can be overcome in a laboratory. By observing their association with mapped biochemical or morphological mutations, geneticists are able to discover the number and location of these speciation genes. If geneticists can find out roughly how many and where these genes lie, they are more likely to have a better understanding of the origins of speciation. Polygenic influence is significant in the course of evolution because, depending on the different combinations of these polygenic traits, different variations throughout species will occur, which is significant for females of species when it comes to choosing mates. To Coyne, one must consider a variety of factors that influence the causes of speciation. Coyne argues that the conglomeration of biology, geography, and passing of time all contribute to the occurrence of different species. He claims that each of these factors, both dependent and independent of one another, can influence a species' likelihood for reproductive isolation. That is, the event that members of different species cannot produce offspring, or if an offspring is produced, then it is sterile. He notes that there is yet no hard evidence proving that these factors directly influence speciation. However, there is a growing consensus that this is the correct pathway for a richer and deeper understanding. First and foremost, one species' biology influences their propensity for speciation. Sexual organs and gametes must be compatible for reproduction, in that the female sex cell can be fertilized by the male sex cell, i.e., the human female ovum is fertilized by the human male sperm. So long as this requirement is met, and the species are similar, it is possible for different species and variations of species to occur. This is why hybrid species are possible. For instance, a male donkey and a female horse can mate and produce living offspring, a mule. But this offspring will be sterile and unable to reproduce. Moreover, Coyne argues that speciation can be attributed to both allopatric and sympatric means. Allopatry is the condition that occurs when genetically similar species cannot interbreed because of geographical separation. Though two populations could be genetically similar, each population evolves separately and at its own pace. Sympatric speciation is the opposite condition, in which several groups of the same species occupy the same geographic location, but evolve differently until they can no longer reproduce and are considered different species. In terms of evolution, it is apparent that both types of geographical stratification, sympatry included, can lead to the occurrence of entirely new species. Coyne reiterates this notion in his review article by claiming that though genetic divergence occurs much more easily when populations are disjunct, some models and experiments show that populations can develop reproductive isolation while remaining in potential contact. From Genetics and Speciation 511. These aspects of evolution would not be possible without considering the passage of time. The longer a species survives, the longer it is exposed to isolating factors. That is, mate discrimination, different habitat preferences, pollination by different insects, etc. The longer a species is exposed to these different factors, the more likely it is that different individuals within these populations will adopt different preferences and behaviors, and eventually the more intense genetic differentiation will be, as Coyne claims. He writes, after sufficient time, reproductive isolation evolves as a byproduct of this genetic differentiation. From Genetics and Speciation 511. Moreover, in his Drosophila research, actually his revisitation of this research, Coyne and his then graduate student H. Allen Orr actually found that the passage of time does have an impact on reproductive isolation. They wrote that reproductive isolation increases with diversion of time between taxa, meaning that regardless of which type of geographical situation, be it sympatric or allopatric, reproductive isolation is both innate between two populations and will increase given ample time. From Coyne and Orr 295. In addition to recognizing the factors that lead to a new species' survival, Coyne had to note the factors that lead to a species' sterility and inviability. When Coyne and Orr embarked on Drosophila research, they expanded the number of species pairs and focused on hybrid compatibility. They found that in hybrid species it is the males that are able to quickly succumb to such recessive traits, because the alleles are fully expressed on the X chromosome. From Coyne and Orr 301. This means that a hybrid male offspring of any species will likely be inherently sterile, and that, though the females will take a longer time to be affected by recessive alleles, they too will eventually be sterile and invisible. In terms of evolution, this hybrid incompatibility holds significance because of its role as a reproductive isolating barrier. Moreover, reinforcement, direct selection for sexual isolation that occurs among sympatric taxa, ensures that reproductive isolation will increase via natural selection. Given Coyne's extensive research and plausible explanations for evolution's occurrence, it seems unlikely that there would be individuals who reject this theory as fact. However, there are indeed evolutionary non-believers, individuals that Coyne has adamantly attempted to sway. Darwin himself deemed speciation the mystery of mysteries, because he was unsure, and rightly so, of the cause of new and distinct species in the course of evolution. Coyne provided ample research on this, and it is because of this contribution that he is respected. For further reading, 1. Why evolution is true. 2. Speciation. 3. Faith versus fact. Francis Crick by Yan Zhu. Francis Crick is one of the most important biophysicists and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. He discovered the structure of deoxyribonucleic acid with James Watson in 1953, which revolutionized our understanding of genetics. Francis Crick was born in Northampton, England in 1916. In his early years he was educated at Northampton Grammar School and Mill Hill School in London. Then he earned his Bachelor of Science degree in physics from University College London at the age of 21. Although he decided to begin his PhD project about the viscosity of water at high temperature at University College London, he was drafted by the military in World War II. During the war, he joined British military research that studied the design of magnetic and acoustic mines in the Admiralty Research Laboratory. After the war, under the influence of Erwin Schrödinger's book What is Life, Crick got interested in the study of life science. In the year of 1949, Francis Crick was convinced by James Watson to search for the secret of DNA structure at the Cavendish Laboratory of the University of Cambridge. According to Crick's autobiography, What Mad Pursuit, a personal view of scientific discovery, he and James Watson used the X-ray diffraction pictures they saw to come up with different models about the structure of DNA. This led them to the great discovery and ultimately established a milestone in the study of life science, since it explains the formation of proteins and chromosomes. In the year of 1962, Francis Crick, James Watson, and Maurice Wilkin won the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. In 1953, Francis Crick and his co-worker James Watson published the paper Molecular Structure of Nucleic Acids, a structure for deoxyribose nucleic acid that overthrew the previous DNA model proposed by Linus Pauling and Robert Corey. Pauling and Corey suggested that the phosphates are near the fiber axis and the bases are on the outside. However, because Francis Crick and James Watson had seen Rosalind Franklin's X-ray diffraction image of DNA, they opposed Pauling and Corey's structure in their paper for two reasons. We believe that the material which gives the X-ray diagrams is the salt, not the free acid. Without the acidic hydrogen atoms, it is not clear what forces would hold the structure together, especially as the negative-charged phosphates near the axis will repel each other. Some of the van der Waals distances appear to be too small. Besides these two reasons, Francis Crick and James Watson also point out that the structure of the DNA should have two helical chains, each coiled around the same axis. Both chains, which are twisted around each other, form a double helical structure of DNA. The bases are inside of the helix, and the phosphates are located outside, which is totally different from Pauling and Corey's hypothesis. The most astonishing breakthrough in their paper is the discovery of the four organic bases, which many scientists call the language that forms the secret of life. Adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These four bases also have a specific pairing order which connects two chains together, adenine with thymine, guanine with cytosine. Before the paper was published, many scientists believed that only protein contained the genetic information and ignored nucleic acid. Crick and Watson's paper showed that DNA contains the genetic information that allows the cell to produce specific proteins, which is also the main factor that makes individuals different from each other. At that time, the discovery of DNA structure had a profound impact on the study of life and non-life. Scientists are now able to study the DNA of different species and unravel the evolutionary tree by comparing the similarity in genetic codes. It also helped establish the foundation of genetic engineering. Although the discovery of DNA helped establish Francis Crick's reputation in the field of biology, there are some who have criticized him for not giving Rosalind Franklin more credit. According to the Science History Institution article, James Watson, Francis Crick, Maurice Williams and Rosalind Franklin clearly indicates that Franklin's data played a vital role in the study. At King's College, London, Rosalind Franklin obtained images of DNA using X-ray crystallography, an idea first broached by Maurice Wilkins. Franklin's images allowed James Watson and Francis Crick to create the famous two-strand or double helix model. In 1962, Crick, Watson and Wilkins jointly won the Nobel Prize in Physiology for the structure of DNA. Rosalind was not honoured for the Nobel Prize because she was deceased, and the prize is only given to those still alive. Matthew Cobb, professor at the University of Manchester, wrote an article about the controversy entitled "Sexism in Science. Did Watson and Crick really steal Rosalind Franklin's data?" which reveals that many people doubt James Watson and Crick actually stole Franklin's DNA X-ray diffraction data. Nevertheless, they, Watson and Crick, did not tell anyone at King's what they were doing, and they did not ask Franklin for permission to interpret her data, something she was particularly prickly about. Today there is still debate over whether Crick and Watson intentionally neglected Rosalind's contribution to the DNA model. Be that as it may, there is no question that Crick and Watson were the first to make the necessary connections which led to their breakthrough. For further reading, 1. The Astonishing Hypothesis. 2. What Mad Pursuit. 3. Of Molecules and Men. Charles Darwin by Ariel Stubbs. Charles Robert Darwin was a famous naturalist, geologist, and zoologist. He was born in Shrewsbury, England, on February 12, 1809, and died in Down, England, on April 19, 1882. Darwin and his 5 siblings were children to Robert Darwin, a wealthy doctor, and Susanna Darwin. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a physician and scientist who had also contributed to evolutionary ideas. Both sides of the family were Unitarian, though his mother's side adopted Anglicanism. When Darwin was 8 years old, his mother passed away. Later in life, Darwin married Emma Wedgwood, his first cousin on his mother's side, and together had 10 children, only 7 surviving past their youth. In his younger years of education, Darwin did not enjoy the traditional teachings of literature and foreign language, but he was fascinated by science and the natural world, which his schools did not teach. Darwin's college education began when his father sent him to University of Edinburgh to study medicine in 1825. During his time there, he learned taxidermy from John Edmonston, joined a student natural history group that debated Christian concepts of science, assisted Robert Edmund Grant in his research on marine invertebrates, presented his own discovery on how the spores in oysters were actually leech eggs in 1827, learned the classification of plants, and helped work on collections at the University Museum. None of this had to do with medicine. Darwin hated the boring lectures and graphic demonstrations, so Darwin's father transferred him to Christ College, Cambridge, in 1828, where Darwin was supposed to be studying for a Bachelor of Arts degree to become an Anglican country parson. There Darwin spent his time riding and shooting, collecting beetles and drinking, but he was still able to further pursue his interests in science, particularly botany and zoology. He followed botany professor Reverend John Stevens Henslow, who believed studying natural science was another part of religious work. In 1831, Darwin finally earned his Bachelor of Arts degree, placing 10th amongst the other students. He then went on a trip to Wales to study geology under the Reverend Adam Sedgwick, another professor at the school. Officially a graduate, Darwin sought to enter the world, ready for newer sights. At the suggestion of Henslow and the inspiration from Alexander von Humboldt, he had published personal narrative of travels which Darwin read. Darwin embarked on the Beagle, a ship that would travel along the coasts of South America and many islands. Though hired as the captain's mate and fellow, he eventually became the ship's naturalist. Along the voyage, Darwin gathered many specimens of plant and animal life, which would later contribute to his theory of evolution by natural selection. In Darwin's theory of evolution, all currently existing species descended from a common ancestor. His theory covers 5 simple ideas. Life has existed for a long time. Offspring are overproduced. Traits are inherited from parents. In each species exists individuals, and nature selects those with traits more apt for survival. 1. Life has existed for a vast amount of time. During his 5-year-long trip on the Beagle, Darwin read Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, a book that describes how the Earth slowly changes over long periods of time. Similarly, life on Earth also must have existed long enough to become what it is presently. Organisms must have passed through generations upon generations of gradual change and divergence to reach its current stage of diversity. These existing generations were likely ensured through the overproduction of offspring. 2. Organisms produce more offspring than could realistically survive. This is to increase the chances of survival, as having more offspring helps counter the likeliness of mortality, whether by predators, disease, or other causes. Even if only some survive, the species can still go on. This allows the characteristics of predecessors to carry on, parent to child. 3. Parents pass down their traits to their offspring. While heredity was not understood in Darwin's time, it was still known that children resemble their parents. This is applicable to all creatures. 2 horses produce a foal that looks like either parent, as would 2 humans produce a baby that carries either of their traits. Despite the inheritance of traits, this leads to variation within a species. 4. Each individual within a species has their own trait variations. These variations could be barely noticeable or extremely apparent, but the differences separate one individual creature from another within the same species. No 2 creatures are exactly alike, similar perhaps, but still different. These differences are what may prove to be beneficial to an individual in survival. 5. Each of these previous concepts serve for a deeper understanding for the final one. Nature selects those with traits more apt for survival. This is otherwise known as natural selection. In a world with limited resources, there are only so many that can survive. If an individual has a trait that gives it a slight advantage in survival, then that individual has a better chance of living long enough to reproduce. Individuals with less favorable traits for survival will have fewer opportunities to reproduce, less able to compete with those more fit to survive. By this process, characteristics better suited for a species' environment are passed down generation by generation, adapting a species to their surroundings. The process of evolution by natural selection requires an extremely long time frame to have reached the current stage of diversity. Hence the concept that life has existed for many, many generations. The large amounts of offspring produced by an organism allows for a higher survival rate, and offspring that happen to be more fit to survive have even better chances. The offspring that live are able to carry on the traits that helped them survive, traits that were inherited from their parents. They are able to reproduce with other individuals in their species, who have their own variations that help them to survive as well. Characteristics not as suitable to a species' environment eventually fall behind, leading to a generation of species without these characteristics, a generation more apt for survival. Applying how species branch out to other areas over time, and would have also had to adapt to those different environments, explains the diverse populations that are present today. By introducing the idea that populations evolve through natural selection, Darwin revolutionized evolutionary thinking. His proposition of natural selection provided an explanation on how evolution happens, an explanation that has withstood many tests and challenges over the years. Despite the controversy that surrounds it, the theory still stands strong. For further reading, consider The Voyage of the Beagle, published in 1839 by Charles Darwin. This book details the journey Charles Darwin embarked on around South America and the Southern Seas. Here Darwin documents his 5-year trip, writing about the different places he visited and the various species he encountered. The journal serves as a good way of understanding Charles Darwin's mind, as well as gives background to his other book, On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. As Darwin's trip on the Beagle was what led to his theory of evolution. On the Origin of Species, which is one of the few great scientific books that can be read by both the specialist and non-specialist, is the book where Darwin introduced the idea of evolution through natural selection. It is also considered to be the foundation of evolutionary biology. In it, Darwin goes into depth about natural selection and its effects on how populations evolve, providing evidence from his time on the Beagle alongside other research. Another book by Darwin is The Descent of Man, published in 1871, where he describes how evolutionary theory applies to human evolution. He discusses the differences between human races, as well as the differences between the sexes. Darwin also details his theory of sexual selection and how females play a more dominant role in mate choice. For further reading, 1. On the Origin of Species, 2. The Descent of Man, 3. The Voyage of the Beagle. Richard Dawkins by Brandon Gillett. Richard Dawkins is one of the most famous evolutionary thinkers in the past 50 years. His ideas have radically changed the mainstream view of evolutionary thought. According to his Wikipedia entry, Richard was born in British Kenya back in 1941. As a teenager, Dawkins rejected his Christian faith in favor of evolutionary theory. He found that it was a more justified model for the emergence of life. He studied zoology at Balliol College at Oxford, under Nobel Prize-winning ethologist Nicolaas Tinbergen. He graduated in 1962 with second-class honours. Richard Dawkins made 3 primary contributions to evolutionary theory. In The Selfish Gene, Dawkins explains that evolutionary selection happens at the level of a genetic sequence, rather than on whole organisms. He claims that animals are nothing but survival machines used to carry genes from one generation to the next as they go about the business of reproducing themselves. He rejects the idea of group selection and directly refutes it in his book. Dawkins claims that all examples of altruism in the natural world result from behavior that directly increases the chances of an organism's genes surviving to the next generation. This explanation requires an understanding that different members of a species may contain exact replicas of the same gene sequence scattered throughout several members of a population. This means that one organism's sacrificial death may still be beneficial to the survival of its genes. A more obvious point in favor of this view is the fact that sometimes the best way to ensure one's own survival is to work cooperatively with other genes in order to benefit oneself. He spends nearly the entire book expanding on this theory until the very end, when he introduces the concept of the meme. A meme, according to Dawkins, is a culturally transmitted behavior or thought. The theory says that a meme is subject to the same evolutionary forces which shaped the progression of genetic sequences. In other words, thoughts evolve. Dawkins argues that the essential element of evolution is what he calls a replicator. Anything that reproduces copies of itself is subject to evolution, as long as those copies have some probability of accumulating minor alterations over time. Thoughts reproduce themselves in human minds through language, imitating behavior, repeating information inside one's head, and encountering circumstances which naturally produce similar thoughts within many different individuals. As these thoughts are transmitted from one person to another, they may be slightly altered through a number of different means. Perhaps someone hears your words wrong. Maybe our imperfect memory causes the thought to be recalled incorrectly. Maybe a certain concept is similar to another closely related concept, and the two get mixed up. Whatever the reason for these alterations, we can see that memes are subject to mutation. From here, the reasoning is identical to that of classical evolution. The mutations which provide a higher probability for the object of evolution to continue existing and reproducing effectively will occur more frequently in their environment. As their offspring appear more frequently, mutations arise, and some of those mutations will be more fit for survival than others. As these alterations continue to accumulate over time, a meme which started as one thing can evolve into an entirely new concept, or branch off into multiple alternate versions of itself. Each of those versions would then evolve further, and so forth. The third significant contribution Richard Dawkins gave us is the idea of the extended phenotype. Dawkins articulates the idea that phenotypes are not simply limited to a gene's effect on the organism's body, but also includes any effect on the world around it. Just as how the presence of some gene in an animal might have effects on its eye color, the presence of some different gene within an animal might alter the characteristics of the external environment. Richard uses the example of a beaver to explain his point. Beavers have a natural tendency to produce dams in their environment. This, like everything else the beaver does, is controlled by his genetic code. The presence of specific genes within the beaver compel him to build dams of a certain height, width, location, etc. This means that variances in a beaver's tendency to build his dam one way instead of another is equivalent to the tendency for an organism to have blue eyes instead of brown. As Richard puts it, whatever its benefits, a beaver lake is a conspicuous and characteristic feature of the landscape. It is a phenotype, no less than a beaver's teeth and tail, and it has evolved under the influence of Darwinian selection. The structure of a beaver's dam is a phenotypic effect. Dawkins doesn't stop at beavers, though. He applies his concept of the extended phenotype to any alterations that a gene has on the world. This even includes a gene's effect on the bodies of other organisms. For example, some parasites which take advantage of a snail's shell for their own survival display extended phenotypic effects. These parasites will actually make the snail's shell harder and more secure, which increases the safety of the parasite. Dawkins claims that these parasites were evolutionarily selected for the phenotypic effect of hardening the shell of their host. Richard Dawkins' ideas have a number of criticisms raised against them. Group selection proponents claim that Dawkins' ideas are paradoxical in respect to the selfish gene. They say that if genes were the primary object of evolution, we would expect to find little to no altruistic or cooperative behavior among individuals of a species. Claims against his theory of meme evolution claim that it lacks evidence. It would be nearly impossible to prove meme evolution because it would require a controlled environment for similar thought patterns to be pitted against each other and allowed to evolve over the population freely. Criticisms of the extended phenotype theory claim that Richard is reinterpreting the meaning of the word phenotype in order to support his theory, and that he gives no evidence of genetic origin for the examples he provides. You can make up your own mind about Dawkins' ideas by reading his original material. He has written a book for each of his three theories. The selfish gene and the extended phenotype each cover the theories for which they are named. To hear more of what Dawkins has to say about meme theory, you can read the book by Susan Blackmore, entitled The Meme Machine. For further reading, 1. The Selfish Gene, 2. The Blind Watchmaker, 3. Climbing Mount Improbable. Jared Diamond by Chin Ling Wang. Jared Diamond, an American geographer, anthropologist and historian, was born on September 10, 1937, in Boston, Massachusetts. He is famously known for his science books, The Third Chimpanzee, Guns, Gems and Steel, Collapse and Upheaval. He is currently a professor of geography at UCLA. He earned his BA degree in anthropology and history from Harvard College in 1958, and a PhD on the physiology and biophysics of membranes in the gallbladder from Trinity College, the University of Cambridge, in 1961. After graduating from Cambridge, Diamond became a professor of physiology at UCLA Medical School. He developed his second career in ornithology and ecology in his 20s. Later, in his 50s, he developed a third career in environmental history and became a professor of geography at UCLA. Jared Diamond specialized in salt absorption in the gallbladder. He also published scholarly works in the fields of ecology and ornithology. He has done extensive fieldwork in ecology and evolution of birds in New Guinea by traveling back and forth to that island and other regions. His earlier books dealt with the subjects of ornithology, New Guinea, ecology, and evolution. He is best known for his number of popular science books, which combine topics from a variety of fields and present unique theories about how and why we evolved the way we did. The Third Chimpanzee, 1991, is Diamond's first popular book. In it, he examines human evolution and the relations between the modern world, including evidence from anthropology, evolutionary biology, genetics, ecology, and linguistics. The book outlines the differences between human evolution and other animals. Moreover, the book also examines the origins of language, art, agriculture, smoking and drug use, and other uniquely human attributes. It was highly praised by critics and won the 1992 Roane Poulenc Prize for Science Books and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Diamond's best-known book, Guns, Germs and Steel, was published in 1997. He found out the reasons behind why the Eurasian peoples had won wars were not because of biological advantages, but rather because of the features surrounding the Eurasian region. The region's high diversity of wild plant and animal species are suitable for living, and the locations of the east and west major axes gave a big advantage of favoring the spread of people and technologies for further long distances. The first part of the book focuses on reasons why only a few species of wild plants and animals were suitable for a good standard of living. The second part discusses how local food production led to the development of compact and layered human populations, centralized political organization, and epidemic infectious diseases. The third part compares the development of food production and human societies among different continents and world regions. Guns, Germs and Steel was an international bestseller and was translated into 33 languages. It has received several awards, including a Pulitzer Prize and the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science. A television documentary series based on the book was produced by the National Geographic Society in 2005. Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, 2005, examines a range of past societies in an attempt to identify why they either collapsed or continued to thrive, and considers what contemporary societies can learn from these historical examples. As in Guns, Germs and Steel, Jared Diamond argues against explanations for the failure of past societies based primarily on cultural factors, instead focusing on ecology. Among the societies mentioned in the book are the Norse and Inuit of Greenland, the Maya, the Anasazi, the indigenous people of Easter Island, Japan, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and modern Montana. The book concludes by asking why some societies make destructive decisions, how large businesses affect the environment, what our principal environmental problems are today, and what individuals can do about those problems. Similar to Guns, Germs and Steel, Collapse was also translated into dozens of languages and became an international bestseller. It was also produced on the National Geographic Society television documentaries and has also been nominated for the Royal Society Prize for Science Books. In Upheaval, Jared Diamond examines crisis resolution through a personal perspective. Jared Diamond gathered ideas from history and psychology in order to see a way forward. He concludes the book by focusing on what crisis the United States and the world might be forced to consider within the coming years. All nations are facing a crisis, which involve nuclear weapons, inequality, and climate change, Diamond claims. While the US must deal with our issues of political polarization, low voter turnout, obstacles to voter registration, inequality, limited socio-economic mobility, and decreasing government investment in public goods. Furthermore, Michael Schaub writes, Diamond is an endlessly engaging writer, and the experience of reading Upheaval is similar to taking a college course from a professor who's as charming as he is polymathic. Diamond's idea on how our nation might navigate its path forward is fascinating reading for anyone anxious about the state of the Republic today. He states there is no way that China or Mexico can destroy the US, but then warns, only we Americans can destroy ourselves. However, Anand Giriharadas, the reviewer for the New York Times, pointed out many factual inaccuracies. Daniel Immerwahr, another reviewer from the New Republic, reported that Diamond's latest lacks the statistical analysis that was prevalent in his earlier work. Despite such criticism, which he has responded to in detail, Jared Diamond is by any measure a great evolutionist. He is an expert in a wide variety of fields, including physiology, geography, and history, and his ability to draw from each of the specific topic in a clear sense to readers is unquestionable and extraordinary. For further reading, 1. Why is sex fun? 2. Guns, Germs, and Steel. 3. Collapse. Theodosius Dobzhansky by Ethan Lee. The evolutionary biologist Theodosius Dobzhansky, originally named Feodosy Grigorovich Dobzhansky, was born in Nemirev, Russia on January 25, 1900, to Sofia Voynarsky and Grigory Dobzhansky. He would later immigrate to Kiev, Ukraine, at the age of 10, and then to America later in his life to develop works that solidified him as a key geneticist in evolutionary thinking. Dobzhansky's achievements won him the Daniel Giraud Elliott Medal in 1941, the National Medal of Science in 1964, and the Franklin Medal in 1973, 2 years before his death on December 18, 1975, at the age of 75. Being the son of a mathematics teacher, schooling for Theodosius was emphasized for him at a very young age. From a child to his high school years, he developed his own interests in biology. He collected butterflies and beetles to study intensively. He would later enroll and graduate from the University of Kiev from 1917 to 1921, then teach at the same college till 1924. During his professorship at Kiev, he met the geneticist Natasha Sivertseva, studying evolutionary morphology, who he would then marry in August of 1924. It was Natasha's studies that influenced Theodosius to pursue the theory of evolution and implement his own genetic hypotheses. They had a daughter, Sophie, and continued to work in Kiev till 1927, when he accepted a Rockefeller Fellowship to continue his research in the United States. It is here at Columbia University, and later the California Institute of Technology, that he developed his monumental discoveries in genetics, later to be known as the modern synthesis. Theodosius' modern synthesis writings are based in part on his studies with fruit flies, which was first established by Thomas Hunt Morgan. In his experiments with the flies he observed correlations between mutation rates and population sizes, both deduced to be directly proportional. Before his studies, most scientists believed that individual members of their respective species had identical genes. During Dobzhansky's analysis of wild fruit fly populations between Canada and Mexico, he found that different populations had different sets of genes. The chromosomes displayed in contrasting fly samples highlighted distinguishing markers that in turn differentiated one population from another. Because genetics could no longer properly identify a species group from another with holistically patterned reproduction of data due to genetic variation, for example, two different species of grass, Dobzhansky was perplexed with what defined or separated one species from another. He realized that the answer was simple. Sexual reproduction between entities defined what species group they belonged to. Theodosius' definition of a species developed into a group of animals or plants that reproduce primarily within themselves. Animals of different species are not likely to mate, but in the unlikely chance that they do, results in incompatible and unproductive hybrids that do not result in offspring. An example of incompatibility between cross-species breeding is between the king penguin, Aptenodytes patagonicus, and the Antarctic fur seal, Octocephalus gazella. To test his theories, he demonstrated through two differing fruit fly species that the incompatibility between them stemmed from the specific genes carried by each fly, leading to a clash with one another. Dobzhansky published his findings in his groundbreaking book Genetics and the Origin of Species in 1937, which complemented Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. It is here where he redefined the term evolution through a more genetic point of view, a change in the frequency of an allele within a gene pool, genetics and the origin of species. His writings explained how natural selection was determined and motivated by genetic mutations in a species' DNA over periods of time. For a new species to come into existence, mutation is necessary, whether they be beneficial or detrimental. If flies reproduce with one another, they create variability in their genes that can differ from the same species of fly. Within this isolated fly population, if continued reproduction between the same group occurred where a separation of that respective population develops, both naturally and unnaturally, such as separation caused by natural disasters, they would slowly diverge from their parent genetics. Now that the isolated flies are only breeding within their own population, any mutations developed would not be passed to their previous parent species, and in turn a new species would develop from increasingly different genetic makeups. These differing genes would grow incompatible with the genes of the original group they derived from. Dobzhansky argued that if isolation between the same population groups occurred long enough, interbreeding with the separated groups would become impossible, and a new species would be created. These developments crystallized the modern synthesis and its implementations in the overall theory of evolution. Dobzhansky's findings allowed for an evolutionary theory that can be predictable. Because mutations are the seed to natural selection and evolution according to the modern synthesis, the predictability of a rising species can be observed. Knowing that mutations between the isolation of the same species will lead to genetic drift and, given enough time, a new species. The modern synthesis itself was not coined by Dobzhansky. Instead, it is the combination of Darwin's theory of evolution and Gregor Mendel's genetics that Dobzhansky greatly influenced. Though he only worked with fruit flies, Drosophila pseudo-obscura, Dobzhansky's evolutionary genetics gave a definitive definition to evolution and natural selection, all stemming from his chromosome research. The zoologist Julian Huxley, the first to use the term the modern synthesis, contributes his own evolutionary ideas to Dobzhansky in his book Evolution, the Modern Synthesis. Other writings that delve more into Theodosius' theories and findings are in his books Mankind Evolving, the Evolution of the Human Species, where he explores the evolution of mankind, and Genetic Diversity and Human Equality, where he addresses correlations between genetic inheritances in human beings and the false implications of race. For further reading, 1. Genetics and the Origin of Species, 2. Mankind Evolving, the Evolution of the Human Species, 3. The Roving Naturalist, Travel Letters of Theodosius Dobzhansky. Niles Eldredge by Una Shing. Born on August 25, 1943, Niles Eldredge is a well-known biologist and paleontologist. As a scholar who claims he is not a science person, he has made great contributions to our understanding of human evolution and anthropology. He is also a successful writer, contributing his time to educate the general public and students on biodiversity and its many tribulations through over 160 scientific articles, books, and reviews. Today he is the father of 4 and a grandfather. He lives in Ridgewood, New Jersey, with his wife. Beyond academic knowledge, Eldredge has a great interest in music. He tends to spend his leisure time playing the jazz trumpet. Combining work and hobbies, Eldredge compares the historical development timeline of cornets and the development of trilobites to highlight the failures of intelligent design. Eldredge was raised in a humble family. He is the only son of Robert and Eleanor Eldredge. His father was an accountant and his mother was a homemaker. In high school he did exceptionally well in subjects related to language and humanities. To fully utilize his strengths, Eldredge started his undergraduate study in Columbia College at Columbia University, majoring in Latin. Originally he planned to go to graduate school with an emphasis in law, and eventually become a lawyer. As he continued his study at Columbia, he soon discovered that he had a keen interest in academic research. As a result, Eldredge began his first job at the American Museum of Natural History, in hopes to gain a deeper understanding of the relationship between science and human culture. This museum is one of his favorite places in Westchester County since he was a child. While working, Eldredge got a chance to work on a project sponsored by the National Science Foundation. During his college years, he met Stephen Jay Gould. They were both interested in studying fossil records and human biology. Gould later established a famous evolutionary theory with Eldredge, punctuated equilibrium. Before completing his undergraduate degree, he decided to switch his major to geology under Norman D. Newell. Graduating summa cum laude, Eldredge continued his research at the museum while entering the doctoral program in philosophy at the same university. In 1969, Eldredge became an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia College. He also held the position as curator in the Department of Invertebrates at the American Museum of Natural History. At the same time, he began to collect invertebrate fossils from the Brazilian fishing village reef. While collecting invertebrates, Eldredge gained a better understanding of evolution through the physical pattern of fossils. He found that only minor changes occur in fossil records for the same species over a long period of time. However, a dramatic difference in fossil records for the same species is seen at another epoch. Instead of gradual changes, there isn't any fossil to support the transitional period that occurred. He started questioning the existing belief of evolutionary process and began to investigate the hierarchy relationships of animals as well as the patterns of descent over time. In 1972, Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould developed the evolutionary theory of punctuated equilibrium, the most famous and debatable research he has ever proposed. Punctuated equilibrium refers to the evolutionary changes of plants and animals in a relatively faster way. It proposes that once a species appears in the fossil record, the population of it will become stable, showing little evolutionary change for most of its geological history. This state of little or no morphological change is called stasis. However, the steady pace is punctuated by a rapid burst of change that results in a new species, and that leaves few fossils behind. For example, a species of sea animals has existed for thousands of years. It remains in stasis status from the very beginning, showing little evolutionary change over this time period. Suddenly the water temperature rises, this is the rapid burst of change, and prompts the sea animals to find a new way to survive. In order to do so, the sea animals must adapt to the new temperature. Through adaptations, their physical characteristics have evolved and became different from the original traits. The sea animals that failed to adapt to the new environment eventually died, leaving the survivors inherited with their newly developed traits. It sparks a change in the evolution of sea animals for the first time in thousands of years. Through the reproduction of the survivors, new traits get passed down, leaving some of their ancestors' old traits behind. It therefore marks a new static period of evolution until the next burst of change arrives. Punctuated equilibrium perfectly explains why there aren't any transitional fossil records found. Instead of having a gradual transition, species evolve in a jumping pace. Eldridge has published various works to help the general public gain a deeper understanding of evolution. The book Life Pulse, Episodes from the Story of the Fossil Record, provides a more comprehensive explanatory on punctuated equilibrium. The Pattern of Evolution provides the reader a fuller picture of reproduction. He argues that simple reliance on the competition to reproduce fails to explain cross-genealogical patterns in the history of life. Eldridge further explains the driving force behind the biological evolution. He proposes that geological and other events are intricately linked to how species developed over time. Apart from biology, Eldridge is also an expert in paleontology. Published in 1980, Phylogenetic Patterns and the Evolutionary Process investigated the relationship between a group of species or certain tribes' heritable traits and evolutionary history. His contribution to the world of science has been substantial. For further reading, 1. Time frames. 2. The Triumph of Evolution. 3. Eternal Ephemera. Stephen Jay Gould by Diana Hernandez. Stephen Jay Gould was a world-renowned scientist and revered evolutionary theorist. He was a man of many parts, yet was most famously known as an American paleontologist and historian of science. Gould spent the better part of his teaching career at Harvard University. Throughout his career, he remained a productive scholar who consistently published books, articles, essays, and reviews. He was undeniably one of the most influential authors of popular science of his generation. Gould's most compelling contribution to evolutionary theory was the theory of punctuated equilibrium. It was developed in 1972 alongside fellow paleontologist Niles Eldridge. The theory proposes that, rather than being steady and gradual, evolution is defined by long periods of stability, which is infrequently punctuated by swift periods of cladogenesis. Gould's empirical research was largely based on land snails, Carrion and Poecilia zonites. He was the leading light in the world of snail genetics. Gould established popularity among the general public through his essays in Natural History magazine. Carol Kasuk-Yoon of the New York Times stated that Gould is, perhaps, the best-known evolutionary biologist since Darwin. Needless to say, he was revered and reviled by colleagues, making him the object of both admiration and jealousy. Gould was born on the 10th of September 1941 to Leonard and Eleanor Gould. Leonard was a World War II veteran, a left-wing activist with an interest in natural history, and a court stenographer for a living. Eleanor was an artist and entrepreneur whose parents were Hungarian immigrants. In the final essay of his 27-year series in Natural History magazine, Gould recalled his grandparents, who rose from poverty to solvency as garment workers in the streets of New York. Gould and his younger brother Peter were raised in the middle-class neighborhood of Bayside in Queens. On one fateful day, Leonard's passion for natural history led him and his son to the American Museum of Natural History. It was here, in the Hall of Dinosaurs, where Gould first laid eyes upon a Tyrannosaurus rex. Unbeknownst to him, this interaction would single-handedly change the course of his entire life. From this moment on, Gould knew he would spend the rest of his life studying fossils. Gould's interest in paleontology never ceased, and decidedly grew from a passion into a career. Gould double-majored in geology and philosophy, and earned an A.B. from Ohio-based Antioch College in 1963. During his time here, Gould studied abroad at the University of Leeds in England. It was here that he led demonstrations week after week outside of the largest dance hall in Britain, the Mecca Locarno Ballroom in Bradford, for refusing to admit black people. After his undergraduate studies, Gould returned to New York to study evolutionary biology and paleontology at Columbia University. Under the guidance of Norman Newell, he graduated in 1967 with a doctorate in paleontology. Upon completion of his graduate work, he was promptly hired by Harvard University, where he worked until the end of his lifetime. While at Harvard, Gould established his teaching reputation. He was one of the university's most visible and engaging instructors. The subjects he taught ranged from biology, geology, history of science, and paleontology. 6 short years later, in 1973, he was promoted to Professor of Geology and Curator of Invertebrate Paleontology in the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. By 1982, the university named him the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology. In 1983, Gould was awarded a fellowship at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he later served as president, 1999 to 2001. Gould's research focused primarily on invertebrate paleontology, namely the form and growth of land snails. During 1985 to 1986, he served as president of the Paleontological Society and later as president of the Society for the Study of Evolution, 1990 to 1991. He was no stranger to being bestowed honors. In 1975, he earned the Shushirt Award for Excellence in Paleontological Research for a paleontologist under the age of 40. In 1989, he was elected into the National Academy of Sciences. In 1996, he was hired as the visiting research professor of biology at New York University. By 2001, he had been named Humanist of the Year by the American Humanist Association for his lifetime's work. In 2008, after his death on May 20, 2002, he was awarded the Darwin-Wallace Medal. Previously, this medal had been awarded only once every half-century. Similar to Darwin, he was most celebrated for his interpretation of facts acquired by others, not for his own research. Though Gould coined the term punctuated equilibria, it was Niles Eldredge who first presented the theory of punctuated equilibrium in his graduate studies. During an interview with the Academy of Achievement, Gould said, "Punctuated equilibrium argues a geological perspective. Evolutionary change is concentrated in geologically sudden, but actually slow by the scale of our lives, bursts of speciation, and then stability is the norm for species in between. He argued that the implications that followed for evolutionary theory differed from traditional views, including the idea that evolutionary trends are not pushing a ball up an inclined plane by slow and steady and continuous adaptations. He likened it to climbing a staircase, stating, "The reasons why you take a lateral step on the staircase are very different from why you slowly and steadily push the ball up." The landmark paper, Punctuated Equilibria, published in 1972, was established upon I. Michael Lerner's theories of developmental and genetic homeostasis, and Ernst Mayr's interpretation of geographic speciation. Phyletic gradualism is regularly contrasted against the theory. In the famous original essay by Gould and Eldridge, phyletic gradualism is defined as a model of evolution which theorizes that most speciation is slow, uniform, and gradual. In this mode of evolution, through a process called anagenesis, an entire species steadily transforms into a new species. There is no evidence of a clear distinction between a descendant and ancestral species unless cladogenesis occurs. The theory of punctuated equilibrium suggests that the Darwinian degree of gradualism is practically unsubstantial in the fossil record. It argues that lack of motion, or stasis, influences the history of nearly all fossil species. In his book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, Gould stated that his theory amended a key pillar in the central logic of the Darwinian theory. Criticisms from the evolutionary biology community assert that the theory offers only modification to neo-Darwinism. Fellow evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins believes that the gaps in the fossil record are not to be attributed to evolutionary but rather migratory events. In his book The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins highlights that punctuated equilibrium has been oversold by some journalists. He asserts that the thesis does not deserve a particularly large measure of publicity. He described it as an interesting but minor wrinkle on the surface of neo-Darwinian theory. To his credit, in his book The Extended Phenotype, 1982, he stated the theory was of great interest to biology. Stephen Jay Gould was outspoken and controversial, and his work on evolutionary theory was groundbreaking. His award-winning publications expanded the world of science to thousands of readers. The catalogue of his work, spanning from 1965 to 2000, includes 22 books, 101 major book reviews, 300 essays, and 479 peer review papers. He was a prolific writer, and a rare figure to be canonized as a living legend by the Library of Congress. Richard Lewontin, friend and colleague of Gould's for 25 years, said the following of him: "He was very creative and original in his studies of evolution, an expert at taking new discoveries and applying them to an understanding of evolution. He had a good feeling for the complexity and variation involved in evolution. Secondly, he was the best science writer for the public when it came to explaining evolution. Steve did not try to make it simple. He tried and succeeded in explaining the complications." Gould was respected and admired by the masses. His influence was far and wide-reaching, and his contributions to our understanding of evolutionary biology and paleontology are likely to withstand the test of time. Nothing is more dangerous than a dogmatic world-view, nothing more constraining, more blinding to innovation, more destructive of openness to novelty. Stephen Jay Gould. For further reading, 1. Ever Since Darwin, 2. The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, 3. The Panda's Thumb. J.B.S. Haldane by Faizan Merchant. John Burdon Sanderson Haldane was born on November 5, 1892, in Oxford, England, to a prominent scholarly family. At age 8, he started working in a home lab with his father, John Scott Haldane, who was a physiologist at Oxford University. Haldane was an autodidact and developed interests in a variety of different fields at a very young age. He used self-experimentation as a method of discovering more about the human respiratory system. In some of these experiments, Haldane would put himself in a decompression chamber and test different levels of gases and its effects on humans, rendering him unconscious many times. Throughout his early school years, Haldane was a gifted student. He attended Eton College and the New College at the University of Oxford, graduating with honours in mathematics in 1912 and the classics in 1914. Haldane's research was interrupted when he joined the Black Watch in the First World War, serving in France and Iraq. He released himself from the commission in 1920 and started a fellowship at the New College at the University of Oxford. There, he studied many different subjects, ranging from physiology to genetics. In 1924, Haldane published a book called Daedalus, which covered a range of topics, including ethics within science, and even alluded to the future of human evolution through cloning, a term he had created. He then moved to Cambridge University, where he taught biochemistry and became more engrossed in studying the mathematical aspect of genetics. In the 1930s, Haldane became the professor of genetics at the University College London, where he stayed for the majority of his academic career. In 1932, he had released Causes of Evolution, a book summarizing a group of papers and lectures he had created about mathematical modeling using Mendelian genetics and Darwin's theory of evolution. Haldane contributed a large amount of research towards genetics, discovering mathematical models that allowed for the identification of certain parts of genes that affect human traits, such as colorblindness. In 1956, Haldane left the University College London and moved to India, a place he had wanted to travel to after visiting during the First World War. Haldane took Indian citizenship and became the head of biometry at the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata, India. There he created inexpensive and innovative ways to research plant genetics. Haldane died on December 1, 1963, in Bhubaneswar, India, due to colon cancer. J.B.S. Haldane was an important figure of the 20th century who contributed to many different scientific fields, yet his most famous discoveries are found within evolution and genetics. One of his first investigations into Mendelian genetics occurred in 1908, when he, along with his sister Naomi Mitchison, began breeding guinea pigs and mice in order to show genetic linkage in mammals. This demonstrated that certain genetic traits are inherited together due to their close proximity to each other. Eventually, Haldane wrote a paper about genetic linkage called The Reduplication in Mice in 1915, while he was in the front-line trenches during the First World War. He later demonstrated genetic linkage in other animals, such as chickens and later humans. In 1929, Haldane wrote an article called Origin of Life, which described the prehistoric ocean as a hot, dilute soup. Haldane, 1929. This led to the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis, also known as the primordial soup theory. The theory described the early days of Earth's reduced atmosphere as an energy source, causing the ocean below to endure many different chemical reactions, leading to the creation of lifeless cells in different organic compounds. These organic compounds, Oparin and Haldane hypothesized, led to the first live cells, which are considered to be the origin of life on Earth. Haldane's most well-known contribution is being one of the founding fathers of population genetics, along with Ronald Fisher and Sewell Wright. Population genetics is the study of genetic variation within a given population. It became one of the cornerstone disciplines which influenced and caused the modern synthesis. The modern synthesis was the moment when Darwinian evolution merged with Mendelian genetics to create the unified theory of evolution. Given Haldane's mathematical background, he began working on trying to discover a connection between Darwin's theory of natural selection and Mendel's work on genetics through the use of mathematical evidence. He published a series of 10 papers between 1924 and 1932, called A Mathematical Theory of Natural and Artificial Selection, in which he summarized that a satisfactory theory of natural selection must be quantitative. In order to establish the view that natural selection is capable of accounting for the known facts of evolution, we must show not only that it can cause a species to change, but that it can cause it to change at a rate which will account for present and past transmutation. Haldane, 1924, page 19. The papers were later summarized in his famous book called Causes of Evolution in 1932. In these papers, Haldane used mathematical and statistical methods to predict how widespread a mutated gene would be inherited across a population, and at what rate it would occur in terms of generations. He analyzed mutated alleles or mutations in certain pieces of DNA within a gene. He then looked at how the mutation of the gene affected the organism's fitness or ability to reproduce. For example, if a beneficial mutation occurred within a gene of an organism, allowing for trichromatic vision or the ability to see more colors, this would allow that organism to find more types of food. Since more food would be available for the organism, their fitness would increase when compared to the rest of the population without that mutation. As the population of organisms with the mutated gene reproduced more, in some cases they would replace the population without the mutated gene. Haldane created theoretical scenarios with fixed variables for population sizes, the number of offspring produced, and the rates at which a mutated gene would be inherited in order to form mathematical formulas and models of prediction. He also coined the phrase cost of natural selection, which referred to the deaths that must occur for a newly mutated gene to be substituted into a population of organisms. He applied these models to real-world scenarios, such as the evolution of the body color of peppered moths during the Industrial Revolution. In most cases, his models held up and were able to predict data accurately. Haldane had created a way to quantitatively show that Darwin's theory of natural selection was a direct effect of the role Mendelian genetic inheritance played in evolution. J.B.S. Haldane was an interesting and influential figure who made new discoveries in a range of disciplines: genetics, evolution theory, physiology, and biometry, to name a few. He was one of the founding fathers of population genetics, and helped bring about the modern synthesis through the use of biology and mathematics. For further reading, 1. Possible worlds. 2. On being the right size. 3. Daedalus, or Science and the Future. William Donald Hamilton, by Emily Park. William Donald Hamilton, also known as W.D. Hamilton, was born on August 1, 1936, in Cairo, Egypt. His father, Archibald Milne Hamilton, was a civil engineer stationed in Egypt when W.D. Hamilton was born, but his family moved back to Kent, England, where Hamilton grew up and obtained his education. After developing a passion for insects and evolution, he pursued multiple routes of education. As an undergraduate, he pursued the study of genetics at the University of Cambridge, and then pursued graduate study at the University College London and the London School of Economics. After finishing his studies, he focused on the educational field, working as a lecturer at Imperial College in 1964. In 1977, he became a professor and curator at the Museum of Zoology at the University of Michigan. In 1984 he started his last occupation as a research professor at the Royal Society at Oxford University. Hamilton was an outstanding evolutionist because of his ability to connect mathematical reasoning to the evolutionary problems that he studied. His most widely accepted and known theory is his mathematical equation known as Hamilton's rule. His rule, commonly found in evolutionary textbooks, seeks to explain inclusive fitness while predicting the evolution of social behavior under the factors of relatedness, benefits, and cost. In order to understand inclusive fitness, the components of it must be explained first. Fitness in general regards to an individual's ability to survive and pass on its genes. There are two types of fitness, classified as indirect and direct. Direct fitness refers to the measure of reproductive success through the number of offspring an individual produces, whereas indirect fitness refers to the genetic success of an individual based off the number of relatives that are present. The combination of the two fitness forms inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness serves to explain altruism, a behavior where individuals increase the fitness of another individual, typically relatives, at the cost of their own lives, serving as a detriment to themselves. Altogether, Hamilton's rule and altruism explain kin selection. Kin selection can be defined as the increase in individuals' inclusive fitness when they engage in altruistic behavior to enhance the reproductiveness of their relatives. Hamilton's rule states that RB is greater than C. The R represents the relatedness of the individuals, the B represents the benefit that is received by one of the individuals, and the C represents the cost that is faced by the other individual, who is also known as the altruist. The Belding's ground squirrel can be used to better describe this theory and how Hamilton's rule works in the real-world setting. The Belding's ground squirrels use altruistic behavior of alarm calls to alert their nearby relatives of predators. The individuals that make the alarm call are serving as a detriment to themselves at the benefit of saving their relatives. Making an alarm sound puts the ground squirrel's life in danger, but they are willing to do so to keep their relatives alive, even at the cost of losing their own. The relatedness, R, in the situation, is the ground squirrel's and its nearby relatives. The benefit, B, is that the relatives will hear the call that there is a predator nearby and will find a way to protect themselves. The cost, C, is that the one individual who is giving out the call is putting their life in danger for the predators to find them more easily. Essentially, one squirrel is giving up his or her life so that their relatives can continue to live. In short, the altruistic behavior of alarm calling boosts the inclusive fitness of the Belding's ground squirrel, because although one puts its life at risk, the chances of its family members to survive and reproduce are higher. This plays into the social evolution, because it was believed that these behaviors will be passed on. However, Hamilton's rule has skeptics because it relies on what is already occurring, but cannot be used to predict how every species will react. Hamilton also developed an interest in the evolution of sex and sex ratios. He was fascinated in why individuals engage in sexual reproduction when asexual reproduction seemed much more advantageous. Hamilton opened a new field of discoveries to understand this question. He hypothesized and further discovered that sexual reproduction was an adaptation formed to resist parasites that developed faster than their hosts. Sexual reproduction was necessary for genetic recombination to continually make defenses one step ahead of the parasites and diseases. Ronald Fisher's sex ratio theory inspired Hamilton, where he predicted that selection will lead to an equal ratio of 1:1 for males and females. He predicted that if the two sexes were equally costly to make, then the sex ratio should remain equal. However, if one sex is more costly to make than the other, then the less costly sex will be produced more. Hamilton furthered this idea with his phenomenon called local mate competition, because he realized that Fisher's theory could not be applied to every population. Hamilton predicts in his phenomenon that in certain populations there are certain sex bias ratios. When the population has a female sex bias ratio, more total offspring can be reproduced, versus when the sex bias ratio focuses on males. There is a higher chance of genes being passed on through mating. He concluded that in undivided populations the 1-to-1 ratio remains true from Fisher's predictions, but in a divided population female-biased sex ratios are favorable so that more offspring can be produced. Hamilton expressed how the 1-to-1 ratio was not applicable in every case where the sex bias ratios are dependent on the environment. Intrigued by the controversial beginnings of HIV, W.D. Hamilton ventured to Congo to explore the disease himself. While in Congo, he contracted malaria, which caused multiple complications to his organs. He was rushed back to London but died at the hospital on March 7, 2000, after he fell into a coma. Hamilton has left behind 3 daughters and has encouraged many to further discover the unknown about evolution. For further reading, 1. Narrowlands of Geneland, Volume 1, 2. Narrowlands of Geneland, Volume 2, 3. Narrowlands of Geneland, Volume 3. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck by Gavin Lee. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was born as the youngest son to a family of 11 on August 1, 1744. While spending most of his youth in a Jesuit seminary where he was being groomed to become a priest, Lamarck received the unfortunate news of his father's passing. In 1761, a time of unrest, Lamarck decided to abandon his Catholic training to serve his role as a soldier in the French army against Germany. It was during his first battle in which he displayed acts of bravery and was quickly promoted to the position of an officer. Lamarck continued to serve garrison duty in the south of France until his accidental injury forced him to leave the army. Shortly after his departure, he found work as a bank clerk, giving him the appropriate amount of time he needed to become an expert in both botany and medicine. His first book was published in 1778, Flora Française, which provided a means of identifying and distinguishing plant identifications through dichotomous keys. The book was published with the help of Buffon and provided him the recognition he needed to later become appointed as an assistant botanist at the Royal Botanical Garden. While his contributions to the scientific community were already significant by this point, it was just the start of his career. As Lamarck's career grew, he introduced ideas that would revolutionize the very foundation of the scientific community. Despite being a leading expert as an evolutionist during his time, Lamarck's work as a zoologist wasn't widely appreciated. Over time, Lamarck obtained a position at Jardin des Plantes, and later he became a professor at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. The Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle was a reorganized Jardin des Plantes, and Lamarck, who promoted the change, was rewarded with the position of an insects and worms professorship. Although Lamarck had no prior background on the subject matter, and that department of science being relatively new, he remained adamant about furthering whatever field he was in pursuit. Lamarck would release Système des animaux sans vertèbres, a book which explained the distinctions between invertebrates and vertebrates for the first time while he was still a professor. Lamarck was a pioneer not only in his field as a botanist, but also as a zoologist. Histoire naturelle des animaux sans vertèbres describes his method of identifying species from different categories, aside from the general term of insecta. Through the specific categorization of organisms, Lamarck's method of identification introduced the possibility of organization in a rather chaotic field. Lamarck's works were only able to create these revelations because of his vigorous analyzing and unorthodox methods he relied on during his research. Unfortunately, some geniuses aren't appreciated during their time, As a result, Lamarck continued to struggle through poverty, even as a professor. Lamarck's greatest contributions towards the advancement of science were without a doubt his ideas on evolution, or better known as Lamarckism. Published in 1809, Philosophie zoologique discussed a theory of evolution which described the idea of eternal life in a sense. Lamarckism was the idea that nothing ever went extinct, but instead they changed into different species. Ultimately, these species would reach a stage of perfection, which Lamarck believed to be humans. Lamarck explained it as changing from simple to more complex forms over time, and for the first time formally introducing the idea of creating new species. While some of the core ideas in Lamarckism were wrong, others were influential and similar to those of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, such as inherited characteristics and environmental effects on organisms. The first law of Lamarckism was explaining how the constant use or disuse of structures would explain a gradual shrinking or growing. Lamarck believed that environmental changes forced an organism to change, and as a result they would have behavioral changes as well. These behavioral changes would modify the species, and these improvements would then be passed through offsprings. The second law of Lamarckism explains how all these improvements are hereditable and why they pass on from one generation to the next. Over time, such enhancements would appear in most organisms due to the fact that species with this improvement have a greater survival rate. Thus, organs which weren't used by these superiorly genetically altered species would gradually shrink or disappear. Lamarck argued that organisms would always survive because they would adjust themselves based on whatever changes occur in the environment and become closer to being perfect. Lamarck attempts to support his beliefs by using giraffes as an example. Lamarck describes how throughout a giraffe's life the constant use or disuse of its neck would make the growth or shrinking a hereditable trait. While this theory has now been disproven, the idea that an organism's life experiences can become hereditary and possibly affect another generation is interesting. It's fascinating that Lamarck's greatest contributions towards society weren't his actions as an officer in the war, but instead as a scientist. His unparalleled ability to correctly identify and classify organisms were what made him stand out among other evolutionists. However, his unwavering passion for the advancement of societal knowledge is what made him a legend. Lamarck was a man who utilized his experience and expertise in various scientific fields to formulate the conclusion that evolution was formed through inherited characteristics. While his findings were incorrect in some aspects, his core idea of how environmental changes affect species structures embodied the main ideas of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Lamarck never received the recognition he deserved during his time. However, that wasn't what made this evolutionist so amazing. It was the fact that, despite battling poverty throughout his entire life, he was able to further societal knowledge of various scientific fields. Lamarck's work would always be disregarded until the day he died, but he never let that affect him. Neither his lack of recognition in the scientific community or economic status was enough to stop Lamarck's contributions. Lamarck began losing his eyesight in 1818 and died completely blind on December the 28th, 1829. Despite all that Lamarck had contributed, he was given a poor man's funeral, and after 5 years his body was exhumated. Lamarck's remains are now lost in time. However, the memory of a man who contributed his whole life towards modernizing science will never be forgotten, especially since his ideas and evidence on evolution were essential to Darwin's survival of the fittest. For further reading, 1. Zoological philosophy. 2. Histoire naturelle des animaux sans vertébrés. 3. Lamarck's open mind. James Lovelock, by Rania Serena Soeterto. In the late 1960s, the widespread presence of chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC, was discovered in the air. The discovery started in a vacation home on the west coast of Ireland, when British medical researcher James Lovelock grew curious about the haze surrounding his home. He sought to find out whether the haze was a natural phenomenon or the result of human activity. For this purpose, Lovelock developed the electron capture detector, which became the first machine to detect CFC in the atmosphere. Lovelock discovered that the haze surrounding his home was indeed man-made due to the presence of CFC. But he also noticed that even on clear days, CFC is still present. Lovelock's findings were critical as it led other scientists to discover the harmful impact that CFC has on the planet, mainly that CFC causes the destruction of the ozone layer that protects Earth from ultraviolet radiation. Famous for his contributions in the field of environmental science, James Lovelock is known for being an advocate of the planet in the ensuing climate change crisis. Other than his groundbreaking electron capture detector, Lovelock is famous for formulating the Gaia hypothesis, a theory that explains Earth's nature as a single regulating system. To this day, Lovelock is still the leading scientist in the field of environmental science, as well as the most outspoken on the ensuing climate crisis. James Ephraim Lovelock was born on July 26, 1919, in Letchworth Garden City, United Kingdom, to a working-class family. Lovelock's mother, like most working-class people at the time, believed that a good education would provide opportunities for her children to rise in society. So she encouraged Lovelock to move to the local grammar school as early as possible. At the age of 9, Lovelock moved to Strand School before he finished his primary education. Lovelock was a precocious and bright child, but he hated his time at grammar school as it restricted him from any individuality. In 1938, Lovelock's school days ended when he received a job interview as a laboratory assistant. His experience played a large role in shaping him into the scientist that he is today. His work also provided him with funding, as he could not afford to go to college after graduating high school. In 1948, Lovelock received his postgraduate doctoral degree in medicine at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In 1961, he began working as an independent scientist. Throughout his lifetime, Lovelock has garnered both acclaim and controversy. Lovelock began his career in cryopreservation, the process of preserving cells and living organisms in extremely low temperatures. In 1954, Lovelock participated in a team that successfully thawed frozen specimens, making his methods highly influential in the field of cryonics. In the 1970s, Lovelock and microbiologist Lynn Margulis formulated the Gaia hypothesis, a theory which Lovelock is most famous for today. Essentially, the Gaia hypothesis argues that all organisms and their inorganic surroundings are closely linked on Earth to form one self-regulating system, which explains the Earth's capability to sustain life. The argument lies heavily on the nature of a planet's atmosphere. If a planet has no life, then its atmosphere would be at constant equilibrium, as there is no reactivity from its gases to produce energy. Lovelock noticed that all the reactive gases on Earth, with the exceptions of its rare gases that are unreactive, are either produced or processed by living organisms. These reactive gases include oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, which are all essential for survival. The relationship between Earth's living organisms and their inorganic surroundings are inseparable, as the gases essential for survival are produced by the organism itself. This explains the atmosphere's ability to sustain life on Earth. Upon its release, the Gaia hypothesis became a subject of much controversy. The theory is widely accepted by environmentalists, but it is not accepted by a number of scientists who criticize it to be more theological than scientific. Lovelock is also controversial for his fervent support on nuclear power as a potential renewable energy. He believes that nuclear energy should replace coal and fossil fuels, as these two sources cause more harm to the planet. Lovelock argues that nuclear power stations do not emit any carbon dioxide, and the yearly waste of a 1,000 megawatt power plant is only enough to fill the size of a medium-sized car, which is insignificant compared to the amount of carbon dioxide produced each year from the burning of fossil fuel. Lovelock asserts that the false fears on nuclear energy are caused by misleading evidence given by governments for political reasons. In his book, The Vanishing Face of Gaia, A Final Warning, Lovelock compares the Chernobyl disaster in 1989 to an incident in Bhopal, India, where an accident at a pesticide plant in 1984 caused the release of 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas into the air. The accident in Bhopal is cited to be the world's most disastrous industrial disaster, with a death toll of more than 3,800 people. But because of its location in the east, it did not garner as much media attention. The Chernobyl disaster received more attention because of its affiliation and implications to Europe and Western countries, proving Lovelock's theory that the public fear on nuclear energy is a misguided fallacy. Outspoken on how we conduct life on Earth, Lovelock is adamant that every organism is essential for the continuity of the planet. Each species has a role to play in Earth's self-regulating system, which is in accordance to his Gaia hypothesis. Lovelock's concern is placed on human activity in the tropics and coastlines, which are pushing a great number of animal and plant species to extinction. In his book, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, Lovelock writes that twice the present human population of the world could be supported without uprooting other species from their natural habitats. Lovelock asserts that the planet has taken too much damage from human neglect and abuse. In 2016, during an interview with the British daily newspaper The Guardian, Lovelock predicts that before the end of the 21st century, 80% of the planet's total population would be wiped out. In 2019, Lovelock has reached the age of 100 years old. He has authored more than 200 scientific research papers and has been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1974. He currently lives with his wife, Sandy, in a Coast Guard cottage in Dorset, United Kingdom. For further reading, 1. Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth. 2. The Vanishing Face of Gaia. 3. Homage to Gaia. Ernest Walter Mayr, by Captoria Frizell. Ernest Walter Mayr was one of the leading evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. He studied ornithology, systematics, and philosophy of biology, and was a world-renowned taxonomist. He was born in Kempten, Bavaria, Germany, on July 5, 1904. He was the second son of Helene Puccinelli and Dr. Otto Mayr. His father was a district prosecuting attorney at Würzburg, but was heavily interested in natural history and shared his passion with his children by taking them to the museum often. Mayr's older brother Otto taught him about the birds of Würzburg. This contributed to Mayr's passion for history and ornithology. At about age 13, Mayr's father died and the family relocated to Dresden, Germany, where he completed high school, joined the Saxony Ornithologists Association, and met his ornithological mentor, Rudolf Zimmermann. He started studying medicine at the University of Greifswald, but after a year decided to pursue his passion of ornithology and began studying the biological sciences. According to Mayr, Greifswald was the most ornithological interesting place, which is why he chose to go to that school. He completed his doctorate at the University of Berlin on June 24, 1926, at the age of 21, and began to work at the Berlin Museum. In 1927, Mayr was recruited by Walter Rothschild to study in New Guinea, where he named 26 bird species, 38 orchid species, and collected thousands of bird skins. According to the Britannica website library, in 1931 he began working in the American Museum of Natural History as the curator of the ornithological department. He mentored many young American birdwatchers and heavily influenced American ornithological research. He played a key role in the publishing of Margaret Morse Niece's 2-volume Studies in the Life History of the Song Sparrow, and encouraged members of the Linnaean Society, who he also relied on heavily for friendship in New York, to take on research projects of their own. He worked tirelessly to unite American and European ornithological studies, and continuously corresponded with Joseph Grinnell to have foreign literature reviewed in the Condor, which is a scientific journal that covers ornithology. He did face backlash and heckling from the Bronx County Bird Club, however it did not stop him. In 1953 he became a faculty member of Harvard University. He served as the director of the Museum of Comparative Zoology from 1961 to 1970. He retired with honors in 1975 as Emeritus Professor of Zoology. After retirement, he continued to publish articles in numerous magazines. He died on February 3, 2005 in Bedford, Massachusetts. Although his wife passed away in 1990, he is survived by 2 daughters, 5 grandchildren, and 10 great-grandchildren. He lived to be 100 years old. Ernst Mayr was very fond of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution of natural selection, which states that more individuals are produced each generation than can survive. Phenotypic variation exists among individuals, and the variation is heritable. Those individuals with heritable traits better suited to the environment will survive, and when reproductive isolation occurs, new species will form. Accordingly, Darwin believed that many species could evolve from more than one common ancestor, which created the species problem. Mayr explained and simplified the species problem by stating that a species is a group of morphological similar individuals that can only breed amongst themselves. This was also an elaboration on Darwin's perception of the unity of life, which stated that all organisms are related through descent from an ancestor that lived in the distant past. Mayr believed deeply that Darwin's theory explained why genes evolved at the molecular level. Mayr was also heavily influenced by Gregor Mendel's theory of genetics, which is broken into 3 different laws. The law of independent assortment, which states that traits inherited through one gene will be inherited independently of the traits inherited through another gene, because the genes reside on different chromosomes that are independently assorted into daughter cells during meiosis. The law of segregation, which states, in the second of the 2-cell divisions of meiosis, the 2 copies of each chromosome will be separated from each other, causing the 2 distinct alleles located on those chromosomes to segregate from one another. And the law of dominance, which states that if one parent has 2 copies of allele A, the dominant allele, and the second parent has 2 copies of allele A, the recessive allele, then the offspring will inherit an AA genotype and display the dominant phenotype. Mayr was so heavily influenced by these 2 theories he became one of the leading contributors of the modern synthetic theory of evolution, which combines the biological processes of gene mutation and recombination, changes in the structure and function of chromosomes, reproductive isolation, and natural selection. Mayr believed that populations within a species may differ due to geographical isolation, feeding strategy, and mate choice. He used evidence from his ornithological studies to display this. Mayr believed that researchers should study the complete genomes of a species more so than the isolated genes. He believed that population thinking replaced essentialism, and that materialistic processes explained the impression of design. He heavily criticized the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, due to the group's searching for them inability to address specific scientific questions. In fact, he thought it was a complete waste of time. He was a firm believer of the scientific method, yet he had his disagreements. In an interview on edge.org, Mayer explained, "Well, Darwinism will not have to do any going because it's already here. In the last 50 years, ever since the evolutionary synthesis of the 1940s, the basic theory of Darwinism has not changed, with perhaps one exception. That is the question of the target of selection. What's the object of a selective act? For Darwin, who didn't know any better, it was the individual, and it turns out he was right. An individual either survives or doesn't. An individual either reproduces or doesn't. An individual either reproduces very successfully or it doesn't. The idea that a few people have about the gene being the target of selection is completely impractical. A gene is never visible to natural selection, and in the genotype it is always in the context with other genes. And the interaction with those other genes make a particular gene either more favorable or less favorable. In fact, Dobzhansky, for instance, worked quite a bit on so-called lethal chromosomes, which are highly successful in one combination and lethal in another. Therefore, people like Dawkins in England, who still think the gene is the target of selection, are evidently wrong. In the 1930s and 40s, it was widely accepted that genes were the target of selection, because that was the only way they could be made accessible to mathematics. But now we know that it is really the whole genotype of the individual, not the gene. Except for that slight revision, the basic Darwinian theory hasn't changed in the last 50 years. Some very influential and notable books Mayer wrote are What Makes Biology Unique, The Principles of Systematic Zoology, and One Long Argument, Charles Darwin and the Genesis of Modern Thought. For further reading, 1. What evolution is, 2. The growth of biological thought, 3. One Long Argument. Gregor Mendel by Christy Lynn. Gregor Mendel, also known as the father of genetics, is well known and recognized for his famous pea plant model that explains the inheritance of genetics. His mathematical formulas and laws, which we now term as Mendelism, demonstrate the specifics of how physical traits are passed down from parent to offspring, and why certain traits are acquired, whereas others are not. Through his notable works and research, Mendel has been one of the greatest influences that have shaped the universal understanding of how genetics are passed on through each generation. Gregor Mendel, also known as Gregor Johann Mendel, was born on July 22nd, 1822, in the Austrian Empire, which we now recognize as the Czech Republic. Growing up in a rural setting, Mendel was raised in a relatively poor family that did not have enough money to fund his education. However, at a really young age, specifically 11 years old, Mendel showed great promise in his academics, and after being sought after by a schoolmaster, he went into secondary school in Troppau, a grammar school, and enrolled in an honours program to further develop his education. After his graduation from school, Mendel attended a 2-year program in the Philosophical Institute of the University of Olomouc to study philosophy. Soon after, he discovered that his talent was specific in mathematics and physics, so he dedicated his later years pursuing these fields of interest. Throughout his time at the University of Olomouc, Mendel did suffer from a period of depression that caused him to lose his passion for his studies, but still ended up graduating in 1843. For a period of time, Mendel went against his father's wishes and studied to become a monk, thus changing his name to Gregor, originally born Johann. While he was a monk, Mendel dabbled in several different professions, and even considered becoming a teacher, but unfortunately he failed the certification exam. Mendel continued his education under many well-known and historically impactful scientists. In 1851 he studied with the famous Christian Doppler, the man who discovered the Doppler effect, to expand his knowledge in mathematics and physics. Afterward he then progressed and moved into botany, or the study of plants, to further his understanding of the biological field. After being exposed to the many different fields of science, Mendel utilized his knowledge and basic understandings to discover one of the most fundamental principles in the specific biological field of genetics. While Gregor Mendel was a monk, he soon became interested in genetics after conducting experiments and research in his garden. The specific and particular plant he used to study genetics was the pea plant, because they were not only easy and fast to grow, but they also had very clear physical appearances that are easy for observation. What Mendel was most interested in was discovering how the characteristics of the parent pea plant would contribute to the physical appearance of the offspring pea plant, and how this will ultimately determine the characteristics of the pea. During Mendel's time, the basic understanding of heredity was the blending theory of inheritance, which stated that offspring were merely an average between the two characteristics of their parents, Bleymaier. However, what Mendel noticed in his monastery's garden was that not all of the pea plants that he was growing possessed a mixture of the parent plant's characteristics. By utilizing the scientific method, Mendel immediately started experimenting to debunk the blending theory of inheritance and prove that there is an underlying cause of why some characteristics are visible while others are not. Mendel was able to control his experiment through a method known as cross-pollination, where he retracted the pollen from the male pea plant's anther, the male reproductive organ, and placed it within the female pea plant's pistil, or the area that contains the female's gametes. The issue was that the pea plants naturally self-pollinate, since each plant possesses both reproductive organs, so Mendel removed some of the pea plant's anthers to prevent self-pollination from occurring. Soon Mendel was able to create several hybrids from two different parent plants, and observe how characteristics are passed on. Mendel took into account 7 main characteristics, some of which were the flower colors or whether the peas were round or wrinkled. He started off by separating the flowers into generations, the pea generation or the parent generation, then the F1 generation, which were the offspring, then to follow the F2 generation. Shockingly, what he noticed was that the pea generation that contained both white and purple flowers produced no white flowers within the F1 generation, but interestingly enough, the white flowers appear again in the F2 generation, making up about 25% of the total flowers. After doing the same exact test but observing the other characteristics, Mendel saw the same exact pattern as the flower color occurring in these other aspects. After experimenting with over 30,000 pea plants, Mendel formulated several notable and famous laws, with the first and most famous being the law of segregation, which states that allele pairs separate or segregate during gamete formation and randomly unite at fertilization, and that the parents can only pass down one allele to their offspring, Bailey. Essentially, what this law explains is that each organism inherits 2 alleles for each trait, and if they are different, one is dominant and the other is recessive. The idea that when the purple flower and the white flower produce an offspring, the color isn't mixed, and only one color is seen, debunks the blending theory, and thus proves that one trait is dominant over the other. This leads to another one of Mendel's laws, known as the law of dominance, which states that the visible allele is referred to as the dominant allele, whereas the one that is masked, or the one we can't see, is known as recessive. After the law of segregation, Mendel formulated another law, known as the law of independent assortment, and together these two are known as Mendel's laws of heredity. The specifics of the law of independent assortment explains how, when the gametes are formed, the allele traits separate, and during fertilization, these pairs are then randomly combined. This means that the genes have absolutely no control or influence over the way that the alleles are sorted or combined. The independent assortment process is best illustrated through a model known as a dihybrid cross, which shows how the different traits of two parents can create several possible combinations, in a dihybrid cross specifically 4, and how certain traits are more likely to occur compared to others. One of the most interesting relationships that should have but never occurred was that between Charles Darwin and Gregor Mendel. Both are extremely talented and educated evolutionists. However, the failure to acknowledge or notice one another's research and theories led to incomplete ideas in both of their fields. For Darwin, one of his greatest concerns was the blending theory of inheritance, which he observed as an incomplete and unsupported theory. However, without the proper approach, Darwin was unable to decipher the science behind heredity, which could have been answered if he looked into Mendel's work. Mendel, on the other hand, had the opportunity to look at Darwin's work, but scholars who analyzed many of Mendel's notable theories argue that Mendel not only does not understand Darwin, but would actually oppose to some of Darwin's ideas. Blameyer. After Gregor Mendel died, January 6, 1884, his works were not discovered until years after his death. Yet when his research and laws of heredity were studied by several scientists, botanists and biologists heavily referenced many of his works to fuel or support many of their own individual studies. Other notable scientists in the very early 20th century even replicated Mendel's experiment to further verify the validity of his work. Mendel has had a major impact on our overall scientific understanding of genetics today. For further reading, 1. Experiments in plant hybridization. 2. Mendel's Principles of Heredity. 3. Monk in the Garden. Jacques Monod by Sophie Wang. When watching wildlife documentaries, people are easily impressed by the diversity of species on Earth. From rainforests to deserts, from the deep ocean to snowy plains, different types of creatures are so vivid, so prosperous, and so lively. At that time, a deeper voice may rise from an individual's inner mind, asking, what is the real meaning of the prosperity of life? What is the essence of life? Is life a secret held by gods, or is it hiding in molecular energetic transformations which are happening every second? Around 60 years ago, Jacques Monod provided his own answers after he made new findings in genetics. Jacques Monod, February 9, 1910 to May 31, 1976, is a famous French biochemist who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1965, along with François Jacob and André Wolff, for discoveries concerning genetic control of enzyme and virus synthesis. Monod's contribution mainly focuses on studying the genetic control of enzymes. In the research of the controlling process of E. coli's lactose metabolism, Monod and F. Jacob found the difference between structural genes and regulatory genes. With a kind of special enzyme called operons in cell cytoplasm, regulatory genes could operate a repressor to bound with an operator so that it can regulate lactose metabolism by controlling operons. This discovery not only reflects the relationship between nucleic acids and proteins, but also shows the relationship between an organism and its surrounding environment. In further research, Monod also suggested the existence of messenger RNA molecules, which are a kind of RNA that play an important role in linking the information encoded in DNA and proteins. For the contribution in molecular genetics, he is widely regarded as one of the founders of molecular biology. Monod and Jacob's discoveries show that cells with the same kind of genetic materials can synthesize diverse kinds of proteins, and then can differentiate into different kinds of cells. After giving lectures in Pomona College, he gradually developed his concern on the philosophical meaning of properties of identity and difference that occurs in genetic materials in molecular biology. Based on his biochemical study, Monod collected his philosophical thoughts together and published them into his book, Chance and Necessity, in 1970. In his text, he interprets the philosophical implications of modern biology and suggests that life is the result of natural processes, by pure chance. In Chance and Necessity, he separates his theories into 4 parts, which are the basic properties of life, evolution of organisms, the future of human evolution, and the possibilities of humans' future world. Based on his findings in genetic molecular biology, Monod brings out 3 basic principles of life: teleonomy, autonomous morphogenesis, self-constructing, and immutability of genetic information. He concludes that the secret of life is best understood as the result of randomness. In his book Chance and Necessity, Monod states that living beings are endowed with a purpose or a project, which means that living beings are distinguished from other systems or structures in the universe by the property of teleonomy. Living beings have their own purposes of existence and reproduction, so they need to develop relative biological systems and mechanisms to help themselves achieve their goals. In Monod's study of molecular biology, particular kinds of proteins are responsible for synthesizing organics, controlling cellular operations, and building genetic structures. On the molecular level, these proteins are operators and implementers of organisms' subjective purpose. As Monod suggests, proteins' stereospecificity and cybernetic network guarantees the functional coherence of the intercellular chemical machinery. Because of proteins' operations, different cellular parts can be organized together for achieving organisms' living goals. Furthermore, autonomous morphogenesis in Monod's theories, which means living beings' ability to self-constructing, reflects the complete randomness in organisms' phenotypes. Monod suggests that biological structures and purposeful behaviors of all creatures are determined by different proteins' orders, which are referred to different genotypes. However, as the determining factor of life, genotypes are totally based on random and chance. In his opinion, the secret life is just behind the chemical structure of proteins, which means random structures of proteins can cause tons of different phenotypes as demonstrated by the variety of living beings. In Monod's philosophical system, the real meaning of life is randomness, and the miracle of life is the consequence of randomness and natural selection. Furthermore, Monod suggests that immutability is the 3rd property of life, which stands for the continuous intergenerational transmission of the same genetic codes. In science and philosophy, there are always existing variables and constants. Monod believes that the basic strategy of science is to continuously explore reliable constants, invariants, in infinite differences. Infinite differences are superficial phenomena in the universe, and science's goal is to find out the most basic law of the universe. In Monod's book, he suggests that DNA codes in the cores of cells are constants in molecular biology, which represents the immutability of life. Monod believes that immutability as the basic characteristic of living beings determines that all living beings' bodies are strongly conservative systems, which means they prevent any reformation or revolution in their structures. The reason why evaluation could still happen is because biological mechanisms cannot prevent randomness from happening. Just like any object in the universe cannot avoid quantum perturbation, living beings also cannot avoid randomness. In this case, the randomness that occurs in organisms is the gene differentiation. Because of the random change that happens in nucleotides' locations and orders, DNA differentiation invariably happens and causes variance in phenotypes. Because humans generally lack a biological understanding about the origin of genetic codes, they still don't properly appreciate how genetics control life itself. Also, because we lack an intimate knowledge about our own central nervous system, we still cannot explain the age-old concept of souls or spirits in precise biological ways. Because of our ignorance on all things biological and technological, Monod predicts the future of humankind is precarious and unsure. In Monod's philosophical system, all previous and outdated value standards should be abandoned. Monod wants our ethics based on logic and rationality, not religious superstition. Based on these new ethical principles, Monod believes that it would usher in a kingdom that is beyond mere material concepts, a kingdom of knowledge and creativity. Monod has a number of critics and has generated a fair amount of controversy, particularly three central areas: the theory of molecular purpose, exaggerations about cells' functions, and the absolute immutability of DNA codes. Monod suggests that cells and proteins molecules have their subjective purpose, and even dream for achieving certain living goals. However, later studies indicate that an organism's living purpose is actually a biological adaptation. Moreover, cellular proteins' functional changes are because of environmental changes. In this case, some scientists think that Monod has reversed the cause and the effect of organisms' living purpose. Some scientists also think Monod has exaggerated the function of cells, for he regards cell structures as perfect designs. Recent research shows that humans' DNA codes can be changed by excessive radiation. However, Monod's theories of life and evolution, which are combined with his biological research, still has had a significant influence among certain philosophers and scientists. In any case, Monod has provided us with a radically new purview about the meaning of life and our understanding of genetics. For further reading, 1. Chance and Necessity, 2. Selected papers of molecular biology, 3. Of microbes and life. Herbert Spencer by Alice Elise. Herbert Spencer, April 27, 1820 to December 8, 1903, a social evolutionist and a controversial British thinker of the 19th century, was an early pioneer of the theory of evolution. He is best known for his doctrine of social Darwinism, and he first coined the term survival of the fittest after he read Charles Darwin's theories of biological evolution and natural selection. Social Darwinism was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but later lost its popularity due to controversial interpretations by many respected scholars from various fields. Because of the progression of knowledge in society, cultural phenomena and biology, the basic tenets of social Darwinism were eviscerated. Herbert Spencer was born in an academic family in Derby, Derbyshire, England. He received his early education from his father William George Spencer, who was a schoolmaster. According to author Jane A. Stewart in her article Centennials Herbert Spencer, published in the Journal of Education in 1920, Spencer was given absolute freedom to follow his own bent in the pursuit of knowledge. He played out of doors constantly, studying nature first-hand in garden, field, and woods. Noticing his son's repugnance to book learning, the father did not urge him early to learn to read and write, but encouraged his fondness for natural history. Drawing from nature was his delight, so were making maps from memory, making chemical and mechanical experiments, and listening to the wise discussions of his father's friends and of his clergyman uncle, the Reverend Thomas Spencer. When Spencer turned 13, he was sent to live with his uncle, Reverend Thomas Spencer, who completed Spencer's formal education in mathematics, physics, and basic Latin. Although Spencer turned down the offer from his uncle to study at Cambridge, he was self-taught and achieved a higher education which was mainly in the natural sciences, based on reading and conducting academic conversations with others. After a short period of being a schoolteacher, Spencer worked for a company as a railroad civil engineer from 1837 to 1841. Spencer was a nonconformist, which resulted from his parents' dissenting religious convictions. In his early 20s, Spencer started to contribute to the major newspapers of the day and express his political views. In 1842, one of his major productions in general literature, The Proper Sphere of Government, was published by The Nonconformist, and later he became a sub-editor of The Economist in 1848. Spencer received a large inheritance from his uncle in 1853, and he resigned from The Economist to devote himself entirely to writing. Spencer's major writing included Social Statics, 1853, The Principles of Psychology, 1855, First Principles, 1862, The Principles of Biology, 2 volumes, 1864 to 67, The Principles of Sociology, 3 volumes, 1876 to 96, The Principles of Ethics, 2 volumes, 1892 to 93, and The Nature and Reality of Religion, a controversy between Frederick Harrison and Herbert Spencer, 1885. Spencer was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1902, shortly before he died. According to their website, there were 49 proposals nominating Herbert Spencer, submitted by the Nobel Prize Committee of the Society of Authors. Spencer died in 1903 in Brighton, England, at the age of 83. Herbert Spencer articulated his perspective of evolution before Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, in his article Progress, Its Law and Cause, in 1857, published in Chapman's Westminster Review. However, as expressed by Dr. Paul Halsell from Fordham University, Spencer's ideas received a major boost from Darwin's theories and the general application of ideas such as adaptation and survival of the fittest. Spencer attempted to apply Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution to society, and this social thought is known as social Darwinism. Spencer was defined as a social Darwinist in the 1930s, nearly 20 years after his death. By definition from the database, Britannica Academic, social Darwinism, the theory that human groups and races are subject to the same laws of natural selection as Charles Darwin perceived in plants and animals in nature, it held the weak were diminished and their cultures delimited while the strong grew in power and cultural influence over the weak. And the life of humans in society was a struggle for existence, ruled by survival of the fittest. Spencer claimed, this survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is that which Mr. Darwin has called natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life, in his Principles of Biology in 1864. Spencer's social evolutionism is many things to many scholars, and according to University of Tennessee corresponding author Robert G. Perrin in his article Herbert Spencer's 4 Theories of Social Evolution, published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1976, few of their interpretations are complete or free from serious inaccuracies. Taken together, they are often mutually contradictory, indicating Spencer had not 1 but 4 discrete theories of what he himself frequently termed social evolution, and sometimes social development. Not all, but perhaps a good share of the current exegetic diversity in sociology's empirical history stems from this unrecognized fact. However, many of the implications of the term social Darwinism were largely influenced by historian Richard Hofstadter's view in his book Social Darwinism in American Thought in 1944 to 1955. There have been scholars who argued that Hofstadter's reflection caused the term social Darwinism to be tightly associated with laissez-faire ideology and invoked as a synonym for eugenics. Moreover, according to Professor Richard Weikart from California State University, Stanislaus, in his article Darwinism and Death, Devaluing Human Life in Germany, 1859 to 1920, social Darwinism served as a background to the discussions of Hitler's ideology and the roots of German imperialism, and Hitler scholars agreed on this point. Aside from the controversial orientation of social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer's contribution to various fields of subjects must not be overlooked. According to an article published by the International Society of Political Psychology in 1981 by psychologist Jack Jones from New York, Darwinism and social Darwinism were aspects of the general abandonment of the Christian religion and its sacral emotionality among educated people in the 19th century. They turned instead to material and scientific reinterpretations of reality as matter, force, mechanism, automatism, determinism, chanced adaptation, competition, extinction, mortality. Religion was a dominant force in the Victorian period, but Spencer was an unconventional thinker. He abandoned the Christian faith and advocated for rational thinking and scientific method of examining society and many other disciplines. Spencer was a complex intellectual figure, and this is reflected in the distinctive importance he gave to human progress. For further reading, 1. The Right to Ignore the State. 2. Illustrations of Universal Progress. 3. The Data of Ethics. Robert Trivers by Yuan Lang Tang. Robert Trivers, a famous American evolutionary biologist with a Ph.D. in biology, was born on February 19, 1943. He developed the theories of reciprocal altruism, parental investment, parental offspring conflict, and facultative sex ratio determination. He also has made contributions to discussing the intragenomic conflict and explaining the theory of self-deception. For his education, he went to Harvard University. For his first career, he got hired in a company for writing a social studies curriculum, and there was a section about animals, in which Trivers knew nothing about it. Thus, Trivers decided to study animals with a specialized teacher, who taught him about the power of natural selection, which piqued his interest in biology. He then formally studied the biological sciences in graduate school at Harvard University and came up with his own interpretations of natural selection that later led the way of developing his social theories. Later, he became a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and then he went to Rutgers University with the same position. Later, he also spent time studying animals and AIDS in Jamaica. Trivers' first work on reciprocal altruism was developed in 1971, and it describes a social, moral act between organisms. It happens when an individual with altruism helps another by sacrificing himself a little bit, and hopes to receive an equal amount of the same, or more benefits back from the person who received the help. Charles Darwin's theory can explain the reason why animals with altruism would help blood-related family members, relating to kinship. Robert Trivers also explains the altruism that exists in friendship. He believes that our ancestors have experienced the benefits of reciprocal altruism due to his generosity with others who are not relatives. While doing this altruistic behavior, individuals also consider the fairness of the benefits. If the individuals received benefits from others, he would pay back the benefits due to his feelings of guilt. If the helper did not receive the same amount of benefits back, this action would be discontinued and eventually disappeared. Afterwards, Trivers' other work, The Theory of Parental Investment, suggests that the sex who is more selective when choosing a mate is the one that will put more investment, time, energy, and resources to the offspring. This theory explains the sex differences in nature. Robert Trivers developed this theory from observing pigeons that were settling down in his bathroom window. When he was doing the observation, there were two couples taking place. The males were trying to keep their female pigeons away from another male. And then, during the day when the female was taking care of their eggs, the male went out and wandered around to seduce other females. That is where the double standard is taking place. While the male was not allowing his female to get close with another male, he was trying to get in touch with other females. However, the other females tend to ignore the males. To better understand this phenomenon, Robert read the A.J. Bateman's groundbreaking paper, Intrasexual Selection in Drosophila, published in 1948, which was recommended by his professor Ernest Mayr, a famous evolutionist. He learned that the male and male competition and female choice both exist because the male tends to invest less during sexual reproduction than the female. Unlike the female, who can only produce a few eggs in her lifetime, the male has a higher chance of reproducing as many offspring as he wants, because he can produce millions of sperm per ejaculation. Therefore, females tend to put more investment into the offspring and regard them as more precious. This action explains the reason why females are selective when choosing and preferring a mate, who can be a strong, reliable father to give protection to her during pregnancy and to their offspring. There is also a male choice, but it is less selective due to the amount of investment during the reproduction process. Also, its quality is worse than the female choice because males consider less when choosing a mate. Robert Trivers then developed the theory of facultative sex ratio determination in 1973 from the hypothesis proposed by him and Dan Willard. The hypothesis suggests that the female can adjust the sex ratio according to the maternal condition. Females who are living in a good environment or higher socioeconomic status tend to reproduce more male offspring, compared with females who are living in adverse conditions. This phenomenon of the facultative sex ratio is due to two reasons. First, females who are living in a good condition are healthier. Additionally, the male fetus will have less risk of facing abortion because raising a son tends to cost less than a daughter. Likewise, in 1974, Robert Trivers came up with the theory of parent-offspring conflict to further explain the parent investment. This theory is a belief that the conflict arises when parents and offspring have different standards on optimal parental investment. Generally, the two parents expect to invest equally in each of their offspring, since each offspring, haploid, is 50% related to each of them. However, since an offspring is 100% related itself and 50% related to siblings, the offspring expects to receive more parental investment, PI, than the parents desired to give. If the parents did put more investment into one of the offspring, the other offspring would have less chance to survive. In addition, in 1976, Robert Trivers proposed the theory of self-deception. Generally, the theory suggests that self-deception evolves when people get involved in interpersonal self-deception by avoiding any cues to show in the conscious mind. The self-deception has two advantages. One is for eliminating cognitive thinking when forming deception, and the other one is for reproducing adverse outcomes when deception is revealed. On the other hand, self-deception, self-enhancement, also brings a social advantage by promoting more confidence than the person already has. Trivers explained that humans could be both deceived and deceiver by disassociating the conscious and unconscious of deception. In another contribution made by Robert Trivers, he discussed the concept of intragenomic conflict, where the phenotype effect of a gene is taking advantage of transmission to the detriment of another gene in a genome. From his phenotype view, since every gene is an equal shareholder of reproducing an organism, they all can coincide interest together in an organism's behavior. Each gene has its disposition in a genome for tracking fitness, and there is no way of expressing the gene conflict and benefits of the conflict. Every scholar's work has controversies, including Robert Trivers. In one of his research studies working with other experts, Dance reveals symmetry especially in young men. It talks about why symmetric bodies of Jamaican men and women can symbolize the genetic sign, indicating how human dance is evolved from sexually enhanced courtship rituals. In this paper, Trivers found out that there was a problem with the data for measuring the symmetry, and he noticed that it was his co-author, William Brown, who made some changes to the data and pre-selected the participants of the study. Because of this controversy, he wrote a book called The Anatomy of a Fraud, in order to warn William Brown about his actions. At the end, Rutgers University admitted that there was substantial evidence to prove Trivers' doubt on William Brown, but it took many years to retract the paper. Moreover, Steven Pinker, a psychologist from Harvard University, thinks that Trivers' study about the dance and symmetry of the book lacks deep thinking. He believes that it would be cynical if Trivers became well known by this controversial study, not his social theories. However, because of Robert Trivers' contributions in evolutionary biology, Pinker still believes that Trivers is one of the most important thinkers in the history of biological and social sciences from the 20th century. For further reading, 1. The Folly of Fools, 2. Wildlife, 3. Natural Selection and Social Theory. Alfred Russel Wallace by June Ahn. Few individuals rise from the subpar conditions that Alfred Russel Wallace was born into and achieve scientific greatness. From a family of 9 children, the 8th grew to become one of the greatest philosophers of the natural world. That child was Wallace. His contributions to the theory of evolution by natural selection, predating that of Charles Darwin's published work, will live on to become some of the greatest works of natural philosophy ever published. Alfred Russel Wallace was born on January the 8th, 1823. The second to youngest of a pack of 9 children, Wallace was raised by his mother and farmer, Thomas Vere Wallace and Mary Ann Greenall. The Wallace household never went beyond middle class. Wallace had many business ventures, but failed in most. His investments went nowhere, and his entrepreneurship led to the family's poor financial conditions. Eventually Wallace was withdrawn from the Hertford Grammar School in London. He attended for only 6 years, yet his enthusiasm for education never wavered. He began to scour the many books around his home, some of which piqued his interest in gardening. As Wallace grew up, his interest grew towards the natural world. But to his parents' dismay, he also grew a dislike towards religion. His interest grew as he attended school at the London Mechanics' Institute. Wallace left London for an apprenticeship with his older brother William in 1837. In a journal published in the Geologica Belgica, journalist Greg F. Gunnell writes, "Unlike Darwin, who was a man of family means, Wallace was born into a relatively poor family. His work as an apprentice surveyor afforded him the opportunity to be outside, where he developed his love of nature and began a lifelong passion for collecting natural history specimens. In fact, Wallace's main enticement for travelling to South America and Southeast Asia fit well with his fascination with nature. He was destined to make his living collecting samples of exotic plants and animals that were to be sold in Great Britain. As if destined, Wallace's early years were leading up to his deep and prolonged interest in the natural world. After his brief moments of unemployment and his short career as a civil engineer, Wallace went aboard the Mischief, heading off into the Amazon rainforest. Suffice to say, from this time onwards Wallace remained employed for the rest of his life as a naturalist. Alfred Russel Wallace contributed to the body of philosophy through his theory of evolution by natural selection. After going through layers of biogeographical research, the naturalist found his answer deep in the Malay archipelago. In My Life, Wallace's autobiography, the philosopher writes, "At the time in question I was suffering from a sharp attack of intermittent fever. One day something brought to my recollection Malthus's Principles of Population. I thought of his clear exposition of the positive checks to increase, disease, accidents, war and famine, which keep down the population of savage races to so much lower an average than that of more civilized peoples. It then occurred to me that these causes, or their equivalents, are continually acting in the case of animals also. It occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole the best fitted live." It is intriguing that his discovery on natural selection was discovered at a time of serious illness. In letters written between Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, the two shared similar thoughts regarding evolution. Later on, Wallace requested that Darwin review an essay for him in 1858, which was titled "On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type." Also within these letters was where the differing opinions of the two Enlightenment thinkers clashed. To begin, Darwin pressed on the notion that competition is a recurring theme between the relationships of individuals within the same species. To contrast, Wallace entertained the notion that it was environmental forces that pressured species to adapt and overcome their harsh living conditions. Wallace began to venture into spiritualism in 1865. During the time he was living with his sister Fanny Sims, Wallace was introduced to this subject from her. Prior to this he was a believer of phrenology, the pseudoscience in which the mental traits of a species can be determined from the number of bumps on their skull. Suffice to say, the Enlightenment thinker was not a stranger to unusual and borderline science. He went to seances, examining the ritual, and concluded that at least some of these seances had to be authentic. After disliking religion in his younger years, Wallace eventually returns to the subject with a new perspective. In the end, Wallace's interests and his contributions came from an inherent desire to learn about the natural and spiritual world. He became increasingly busy forming lectures and stories that presented his findings to the world. He began this tour at the Zoological Society of London, a research institute. This period of time was where his research truly became public and astounded scientists. Through 1864 to 1866, Wallace courted 2 women. The second, Annie Mitten, became his wife, and they had 3 children named William, Herbert, and Violet. Alfred Russel Wallace died on November 7th, 1913, passing away in his house at the age of 90. While his physical body died, his legacy did not. On November 1st, 1915, a medallion was placed on his grave in Westminster Abbey. For further reading, 1. The Supernatural Philosopher, 2. The Malay Archipelago, 3. Contributions to the Theory of Natural Selection. August Weismann by Denise Motus. August Friedrich Leopold Weismann, January 17th, 1834 to November 5th, 1914, was a German evolutionary biologist who studied and experimented extensively on Charles Darwin's and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's respective theories of evolution. Weismann was the son of Johann Conrad August Weismann, a classics professor, and Elise Eleanor Lubrun, a musician and painter. As a child, Weismann would collect different kinds of insects and herbs. This hobby proved to be lifelong as he explored evolution in nature as an adult. To his dismay, he took up medicine despite favoring subjects such as physics, chemistry, and botany because of his father and a family friend's advice on the practicality of earning a living. He eventually received his medical degree in 1856. In 1861, he was so in awe of Darwin's On the Origin of Species that he read it in one sitting. Practicing medicine did not hinder Weismann from his other interests. He found time to study insect development and metamorphosis, among other research. Finally, giving in to his childhood passion, Weismann focused on zoology. He spent most of his career at the University of Freiburg, where he became a professor and the first to hold a chair in zoology. In 1864, his eyesight declined, leaving him partially blind and unable to use the microscope effectively. With the help of his wife, Marie Dorothea Gruber of Genoa, Italy, he was able to continue his work on 6 memoirs on insects. He and his wife had 6 children with whom they shared their many interests, including music. As a strong proponent of Darwin's theory of evolution, Weismann promoted Darwin's ideas and added his own theories about evolution. Among Weismann's theories, he is most known for the germplasm theory. He agreed with Darwin regarding natural selection depending on 4 factors, namely variability, inheritance, selection for breeding, and struggle for existence. The last factor in particular was special, due to its organic occurrence in nature. Species do not compete only against other species for space and food. Members of the same species have to compete with each other for limited resources. Regardless of the degree of fertility, only a few descendants of a species would survive. The rest would succumb to the dangers of nature. The principle of natural selection, then, is what is fit to reproduce. This may refer to the organism, one or more parts of the organism, or even stages of an organism's development. Despite praising Lamarck's investigative endeavor, Weismann concluded that the Lamarckian principle of use and disuse leaves so much room for doubt and shows no proof of inheritance. Muscles, nerves, and bones build up strength in proportion to how much they are used. Conversely, they become frail as they are used less. Weismann questioned how this could be the case for animals that are sterile and therefore could not transmit anything to their offspring. He deducted that the Lamarckian principle is wrong and ultimately obstructs potential deeper insights about evolution. For example, the worker ants in certain ant colonies are sterile. They do not reproduce, yet the workers have undergone a positive modification, brain development. Larger workers, called soldiers, have evolved massive jaws and teeth to defend the colony from enemies. Lamarckian principle simply could not explain the evolution of brain or jaws. Weismann surmised that selection takes place in the germ cells of the father and mother ant workers. Males and females have special complexes of primordia, and these complexes contain determinants. Determinants vary. Female eggs may produce favorable varying determinants that could give rise to workers that have undergone positive modification. The germplasm theory, also referred to as germinal selection, builds the foundation of variation which natural selection is based on. The rods, bands, or granules form the germplasm within the nucleus of the germ cell. The individual granules are called ids. Each id plays a role in development, and therefore several ids would contribute to the growth of a new individual. According to Weismann, the determinants vary in the course of development, by growing and dividing rapidly or slowly. The variations in the determinants consequently correspond to variations of the cell, tissue, or organ they designate. In the case that a determinant receives abundant nourishment in a considerable time, which in turn will make it grow rapidly and divide quickly, then the id that develops in the embryo will become stronger than in the parents. This demonstrates hereditary individual variation arising from the germ. Positive or negative selection then favors variations that are advantageous and neglects those that are disadvantageous. Similarly, lack of nutriment weakens the determinants, leading to minimized growth. One of two things may happen. A, if the determinant is associated with a useful organ, it must be removed to bring back germplasm equilibrium. Or B, if the determinant corresponds to an organ that has become useless, the organ becomes vestigial, or may just disappear over time. The IDS determinant system is in a continuous fluctuating trend. Weismann believed that when a part of an organism stops being of use, natural selection withdraws its influence on it. The part ceases from evolving because it does not need to adapt any longer. Weismann also agreed with Darwin's theory of sexual selection. Sexual selection applies only to those who could already reproduce. It stems from the rivalry of one sex for the attainment of the opposite sex. The rivalry affects the sex, usually the male, that pursues the other, usually the female, by equipping the former with unique characteristics that will make it a more ideal mate for the latter. One of the postulates of sexual selection is the unequal number of individuals in the two sexes of the same species. Typically, males have to compete with other males to secure a female. A male would have to be stronger, faster, or more beautiful than the other males in its species to woo a female or several females. The males who are successful in attracting females would have more progeny, and therefore potentially pass on the determinants that made them desirable. Following on Darwin's footsteps, Weismann embraced Darwin's theories and took it up a notch. Naturally, his advanced ideas did not convince everyone, especially at a time when Lamarckian principle was extremely popular. His germplasm theory generated controversy for going against Lamarck's theory. To prove that Lamarck was wrong, Weismann severed the tails of more than 1,000 mice. If the mice reproduced offspring with short tails, then Lamarck was right. Conversely, if the offspring had full tails, then it would prove that he was right. It turned out that his prediction was correct, and so he proceeded to research about variation and heredity. However, Weismann's germplasm theory was not necessarily complete. He believed that germplasm passed on from one generation to the next without changing, and variations came from new germplasm combinations. With the discovery of the chromosome and its function, Weismann's ideas found renewed support. There was now a physical unit that housed the germplasm. Germplasm, which would later be known as genes, contains hereditary material that can be passed on to the offspring, unlike other cells, somatic cells, that did not influence heredity. For further reading, 1. Evolution and natural selection. 2. The germplasm, a theory of heredity. 3. Über den Einfluss der Isolierung auf die Artbildung. George Christopher Williams, by Joseph Perez. A pivotal figure in the modern theory of evolution, American evolutionary biologist George Christopher Williams is best known for furthering the theory of gene-level natural selection, as well as for his refutation of the then widely accepted view of group selection. His work reshaped the discussion of evolutionary theory, serving as the foundation for the works of other evolutionary thinkers, such as John Maynard Smith and Richard Dawkins, who cite him as inspiration for their own acclaimed contributions, notably The Evolution of Sex and The Selfish Gene, respectively. George C. Williams, born on May 12, 1926, in Charlotte, North Carolina, received his Ph.D. for his work on ichthyology, the ecology of fish, while at UCLA. He served as a foundational member of the nascent Department of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University for 30 years before his death at the age of 83 on September 8, 2010, due to Parkinson's disease. Often described as humble and open-minded, he maintained that it is possible that new and better ideas may build upon or refute his own. In his 1966 book, the most influential of his works, Williams introduced the evolutionary community to a gene-centric theory of natural selection, which states that natural selection works at the level of a gene instead of on the level of a group or a species. In doing so, Williams would spark an ongoing debate over group selection against gene-level selection. Adaptation and Natural Selection, a critique of some current evolutionary thought, published almost a decade after the monumental 1957 paper that brought him the acclaim and attention of the evolutionary community, criticizes the theory of evolutionary progress and the prevailing theory of group selection. The book lays out his criticisms of the current understanding of natural selection's workings for wrongly attributing natural selection to the betterment of the group or species to which the individual belonged, rather than to the advantage of the survival of the individual. His own view held that populations do not actively seek to prevent extinction, individuals do. The dominant view of group-level natural selection gave rise to another idea, pan-adaptationism, the theory that every feature has an evolutionary adaptation, which Williams also criticizes in Adaptation and Natural Selection. Williams famously stated that natural selection should be attributed to the simplest option. Claiming that gene-level natural selection ought to be preferred over the more convoluted option at the species or group level, he argued that alleles are the simplest variables, and thus the most likely level on which natural selection takes place. Alleles, he postulated, would be introduced into a population and subsequently rise in frequencies, starting at values as low as 0. Natural selection would operate on the immediate fitness effects brought on by alleles in the individuals. Therefore, for biologists seeking to make sense of evolutionary histories, adaptation should only be considered as a last resort, when all other explanations have failed. As a result, Williams believed that evolutionary progress would not be made through selection, and raised questions over the basis for the theory of evolutionary progress. Biologist E. O. Wilson would further the ideas presented in Williams' first book. Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, listed as the most influential science book of all time by the Royal Society, would derive its title and inspiration almost entirely from Williams' principal theory in adaptation in natural selection. Williams' theory was later criticized for downplaying the role that genetic integration, or multiple gene inheritance, plays in natural selection. In his 1957 paper, Pleiotropy, Natural Selection and the Evolution of Senescence, Williams introduced the still prevalent explanation for senescence, or biological aging, with his antagonistic pleiotropy hypothesis. Essentially, one gene can be responsible for controlling more than one trait. One of the traits may be beneficial to the organism's fitness, while the other may be adverse. Williams claimed that if one gene served beneficial in increasing an organism's reproduction early in life and encourage aging later in life, it would persist in evolution due to the benefits provided early on outweighing the detriments that arise later. Organisms can never be able to reach perfection by design, since organisms' beneficial traits are accompanied by imperfect traits. This results in what could be seen as the hindrance of envisioned evolutionary progress. In the same paper, Williams introduced the grandmother hypothesis, which claims that menopause is an adaptation that is evolutionarily advantageous for women, claiming that menopausal women benefit from being able to refocus efforts that were once spent in reproduction to supporting existing offspring. This shift removes the risk of age-related reproduction threats and helps ensure the survival of the women's genes. However, this hypothesis has been widely criticized for failing to explain why the first grandmother would halt reproduction seemingly without cause, as well as for the lack of explanation for the longevity of male sex cells. One of his last notable contributions to the field of evolutionary theory was his 1992 book, natural selection, domains, levels, and challenges. Williams would go on to lessen his criticism of group selection and include some of its functions and occurrences as exceptions to his original theory. This was largely due to the notion that group selection and multi-level selection can occasionally occur in nature, though he had previously believed such occurrences to be impossible in his gene-centric theory. As a result, Williams took on a more inclusive view, while still maintaining his original allele-driven evolution theory. Williams entertained the possibility of certain instances of group selection, such as adaptive radiation or diversification, into different forms, largely due to change in environment, which can be best explained through group selection. In a sense, Williams' original theory holds as a microevolutionary explanation, but did not take into account certain macroevolutionary events over long periods of time. This led to the adoption of an almost hybrid stance on the gene-centric and group-level natural selection issue later on in his career. Williams would go on to be awarded the Daniel Giraud Elliott Medal in 1992 and the Crawford Prize in 1999 for his work in collaboration with Ernst Mayr and John Maynard Smith. For further reading, 1. Sex and Evolution, 2. Adaptation and Natural Selection, 3. Evolution and Ethics. Edward Osborne Wilson by Vikrant Chowdhury. Edward Osborne Wilson, also referred to as E.O. Wilson, is an American biologist who was born on June 10, 1929. Wilson grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, and from a young age was fond of the outdoors. Unfortunately, he lost his eyesight in his right eye after a fishing accident at the age of 7. However, he was left with remarkable vision in his left eye. This heightened ability to see little things propelled Wilson's fascination with insects. This passion for entomology would persist throughout his life and become a guiding principle for his theories about evolution. After graduating high school, Wilson went on to get B.S. and M.S. degrees in biology from the University of Alabama, and then completed a doctorate in biology at Harvard in 1955. The next year he became a faculty member at Harvard. During the early years of his career, Wilson traveled through many Pacific islands as he worked on classifying ant species in the region. It was during this time that Edward developed his groundbreaking theory of island biogeography with Robert MacArthur. Island biogeography detailed how immigration and extinction of colonizing species were linked to the area of an isolated ecosystem and the distance of that island ecosystem from a similar habitat. This theory proposes that there is an inverse relationship between the number of species on habitat islands and the distance between the original habitat. The theory also develops a model that links the chance of successful colonization to birth rate, death rate, and carrying capacity. Further, the theory documents the 3 steps of the evolution of an island species after colonization. First, the colonizing species will most likely evolve to become K-strategists and invest more resources in fewer offsprings, instead of R-strategists, that produce many offsprings with high die-off rates. Secondly, the species will evolve to better fit the ecological niche of the environment. Lastly, speciation or adaptive radiation may occur to their colonizers. These theories became foundational in the world of biodiversity, conservation biology, and also were applied to biology outside of island ecosystems. Wilson then went on to produce a synthesis surrounding all of his work on social insects that was entitled The Insect Societies. In this book, he begins to build the foundation of his theory of sociobiology, covering topics such as the role of genetics in social behavior and social evolution. He then wrote Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, which is perhaps his most controversial and well-known work. Wilson attempted to explain social behavior through a biological lens, and specifically used the evolution of social insects to draw his conclusions. He argues that altruistic behavior would not live on in a population unless there was selection for it, but advocates that group selection was the main method for the persistence of hereditary altruism. This was controversial within the biological community, where kin selection was the preferred explanation for these behaviors. The book then goes on to explain social behaviors in vertebrates, and how they came to be, but finally extends those theories to mammals and then humans. Wilson essentially argued that social behavior was directly related to genetics and evolutionary principles. Sociobiology was criticized heavily by sociologists. The general consensus of the sociology community at the time was that human behavior were completely untethered from genetics, and was determined solely by culture and organization. Therefore, Wilson's idea that all social behavior could be explained by evolutionary-driven genetic principles was considered deterministic and reductionist. However, some sociologists found value in his work and advocated that more research needed to be done about how human and non-human behavior could be linked. Wilson was even accused of being a misogynist and a racist, as some people believed that Wilson was even attributing the atrocities of human society to genetic predispositions. However, most of his ideas have been widely accepted over time, and the field of study he founded is now being referred to as evolutionary psychology instead of sociobiology. There is no doubt that this backlash and perception that culture was a necessary component in analyzing humans had a part to play in Wilson's development of the theory of gene-culture co-evolution with the help of Charles Lumsden. Together they argued that genetic evolution could lead to favoring of certain cultural attributes over others, and that culture could also have an effect on the speed at which evolution takes place. They also emphasize that human nature is not predetermined by genes, but genes do play an important role in the function of culture. Culture also plays an important role in how evolution takes place, because culture essentially creates selection pressures based on what is and isn't accepted in society. Throughout his career, Wilson consistently brought together many disciplines in order to come to the conclusions that he arrived at. This idea of the need to unite the sciences was documented in his book, Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. Through the chapters in the book, Wilson unites multiple fields in order to bring a new perspective to the topic. He applies scientific principles to philosophy, unites Darwinian theories with genetics, explains how government policy, biology, and social science principles need to be combined for environmental protection, and unifies a host of other topics in order to show the need to exchange knowledge across disciplines. Wilson's quest to change the world is never-ending, and he now is working to preserve the world's biodiversity through the Half-Earth project. He advocates that if we were to preserve half the land and sea of the Earth, we would be able to maintain a bulk of the world's biodiversity. He stresses that biodiversity is a measure of how healthy the planet is. His organization is working to identify key areas that need to be protected, and key species that should be protected. For further reading, 1. On Human Nature, 2. The Naturalist, 3. Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge.